Welcome to Blur, where stories come alive through sound. Chapter 5, Fame, 1952 to 1954. Fame to me certainly is only a temporary and a partial happiness, even for a waif, and I was brought up a waif. But fame is not really for a daily diet. That's not what fulfills you. It warms you a bit, but the warming is temporary. It's like caviar, you know. It's good to have caviar, but not when you have it every meal and every day. By the summer of 1952, Joe DiMaggio had taken Marilyn Monroe home to meet his family. The DiMaggios were used to meeting celebrities and welcomed her without a qualm. When she came to dinner at Joe's family home, Marilyn always asked his mother what she could do to help. Everything she did with gusto, remembered June DiMaggio, one of Joe's nieces. Marilyn did the dishes, spurning Mrs. DiMaggio's offer of gloves to protect the star's lovely hands. Marilyn would plunge right into the hot dishwater, seeming to enjoy the sensation. June recalled. Marilyn confided in Joe's mother and enjoyed girl talk with June. Marilyn impressed June by reciting from memory passages from Emerson. The family's Burmese cat, Minka, snuggled next to Marilyn anytime she slept in the DiMaggio home. Tom Mai, the family's cockatiel, would fly to the front door to meet Marilyn. When a startled neighbor happened on her at the DiMaggio front door and saw the bird perched on the star's head repeating, "Marilyn Monroe," Marilyn turned to the neighbor and with a deadpan expression said, "It's okay. This is my son, and he's here to greet me." Marilyn worked hard at pleasing Joe, downing wild duck even when it nearly made her gag, and fishing with the DiMaggios even though she became seasick. They would play cards, gin rummy and canasta, betting a dime a game. Often in a rush, Marilyn would show up in the most casual kind of FME 62 clothing. One time she appeared in pajamas covered by a mink coat. "I didn't have time to change," she told June. Other times, Marilyn would go clothes shopping with Joe's mother. In her downtime from the screen, Marilyn braided her hair and looked like the sweetest little Dutch girl. On one outing to get birdseed for Tommy, Marilyn traveled without a disguise. A crowd gathered, instantly recognizing the star. "Everyone thinks I'm Marilyn," she said in a thick Scandinavian accent, "but my name is Eve Lindstrom." She even signed an autograph with that name. Marilyn and Joe's mother nearly laughed themselves sick over their little adventure. In some of her pessimistic moods, Monroe gave the impression that she might relinquish her quest for fame, that she was a beautiful person, not simply a coveted image or an approximation of a desirable woman, is what counted with Joe DiMaggio. It counted heavily with Monroe, too, since others had seldom been able to comprehend the nexus between herself and her roles. Associating with DiMaggio also instilled confidence in her and a growing sense of her public prominence, even as her relationship with him promised to pull her clear of the film role/person dichotomy. Her first major film, Niagara, February 1953, made her face, her figure, her voice, and the way she employed them the screen subject. To cast Marilyn Monroe in the part of a femme fatale was not, however, an obvious choice. After the success of Monkey Business, Howard Hawks assured Daryl Zanuck that he could make Monroe a star in light comedies. True, Monroe had excelled in a dramatic role in Don't Bother to Knock, but box office receipts had been disappointing. And as Nell Forbes, the actress had projected vulnerability more than menace. Nevertheless, Zanuck knew he had, in the parlance of the time, a hot property, judging by Monroe's burgeoning fan mail and publicity. Before Hawks found the right role for her, Hathaway convinced Zanuck that Niagara would make her a star. Hathaway believed in Monroe's intelligence and wished she would rely more on herself since she was so eager to learn. Like most directors, he disliked the interfering Natasha Lydes. Hathaway believed that the studio, Joe DiMaggio, and nearly everyone who got close to Monroe did not accord her the respect she deserved. When John Coble interviewed the director, Coble sensed that Hathaway had fallen in love with Monroe. Certainly, his comments to Coble suggest he was one of the few men in Hollywood who seemed capable of appreciating the person and the AC tress. F.A.M. 63 Niagara is a Technicolor film noir, almost a contradiction in terms. Such films, shot in black and white, usually featured a wanton woman who corrupted a male hero. She had to be punished for her crime, murder, or abetting a murder. Although the genre emerged during the 1940s in films such as The Maltese Falcon, 1941, and Out of the Past, 1947, it became a staple of low-budget thrillers emphasizing the seamier side of American life. the nightmare chiaroscuro of cops and criminals who battled over the hearts and minds of communities, determined to overcome lawless elements threatening core American values of justice and fair play. Henry Hathaway had excelled in the genre with films like The Dark Corner, 1946, and Kiss of Death, 1947. In Niagara, he amplified the sexuality of the femme fatale, thereby magnifying one of the underlying themes of the genre: the American male's concern about his own masculinity and his worry that he was not up to the job of subduing the post-war woman, who emerged from the war confident of her own abilities, but also disenchanted with her prospects. Fritz Lang had explored this theme in Clash by Night, but not with the kind of brio and flamboyance that Hathaway brought to the screen by making Monroe the screen's siren par excellence. She is Rose Loomis, a seductress who plots to murder her husband, played by Joseph Cotten, a returning war veteran who finds it hard to adjust to civilian society and to a powerfully sexualized wife. After all those World War II films that featured a man's world, the return home became an anxious journey for men who wondered how they would be received by wives and lovers. This male dilemma is epitomized in films like The Best Years of Our Lives, 1946, when Fred Derry, Dana Andrews, a bombardier in the war, is mocked by his sassy wife, played with appropriate cruelty by Virginia Mayo. How could Fred demonstrate his masculinity any more powerfully than with a war record? And yet, like George Loomis, Fred is at a loss as to how to please and impress his wife. As Frank Kretnick notes in A Lonely Street, film noir genre, masculinity, the more prominent the woman, the more difficult it becomes to validate the masculine ethos. How can the male hero compete with the celebrated cinemascope tracking shot that focuses on Monroe's rear end and her swaying gait as she moves away from the camera? Aspiring actress Ellen Burstyn admired Monroe's commanding walk across the screen, a visual embodiment of self-possession. On the widescreen, Marilyn Monroe became the picture, so to speak, available to everyone and yet elusive. As critic Graham McCann remarked, she was like the movies. We can all see her, FME 64 there, but no one can keep her. Other films would develop other aspects of her screen presence, to be sure, but Niagara initiates the many Marilyns to come, a point Andy Warhol grasped brilliantly in his many portraits of Marilyns, all of which derive from the image of her sing-ing kiss in Niagara. She has to be understood, Warhol implies in the plural. The basis of her appeal is her ability to be reproduced. The Public Niagara, 1953. Ames 65 wants to see that walk over and over again, and film, unlike any other medium, is equipped to replicate the sequence indefinitely. Unfortunately for Monroe, the lurid color in which she is framed resembles that used in the box strips of comic books. Like the parodic sexual siren of cartoons, say Betty Boop, Monroe's character, Rose Loomis, is the target of quips and innuendos. When the nice, neat, and clean young honeymooning husband, Casey Adams, kiddingly asks his bride, Jean Peters, why she doesn't wear tight-fitting dresses like the ones Rose wears, the bride responds that a woman has to start laying plans for such a dress when she's about 10 years old. Such remarks define how far Monroe's character has strayed from the conventions most women follow in presenting themselves, and how deliberately she is consigned to her own peculiar realm of being. Monroe is isolated while singing of kiss, dreamily, moodily, and so suggestively that the crowd of young people who have been dancing recede from her in hushed wonder. As in Monroe's most suggestive public ID photographs, she seems to be caressing herself, to have retreated into the deepest recesses of her private fantasy life. She holds her passions so far away from both men and women in this film that when a young man asks her to dance, she warns him, better not. In this scene, she seems warmed by her own sensuousness, as she sings to the record she has asked a young man to play for her, and as she embellishes the song the camera tightens on her ecstatic countenance. In close-up, in Reverie, her face clearly is meant to arrest attention and to fashion Monroe as a fantasy. The film's hackneyed plot matters very little, except in so far as it furthers the implications of Kiss. Rose Loomis's depressed husband, tortured by his awareness that he cannot satisfy his sensual wife, and that she must be looking for other men who can gratify her, interrupts her singing of Kiss and breaks the record. This act foreshadows the fulfillment of his barely suppressed urge to destroy her when he learns that she has plotted with her lover to take his life. She is bound to die, evidently, because her sexual energies go beyond the bounds of what people can tolerate or the screen can show. Niagara gave Monroe her only opportunity to portray an evil woman solely concerned with herself and willing to commit any crime to accomplish her own ends. Near the beginning of the film, her anxious husband stands over her bed, softly calling her name as she pretends to sleep. There, Me66 is yearning in his voice. He is half-heartedly seeking her sexual favors, although the censorship of the time and his diffidence forbid the making of an explicit request. What he wants from her is clarified later when Rose says of him to her lover, "Here's always a way to get around George." George's momentary relaxation and humor in a bedroom scene shortly afterwards proves her point. This venal employment of sex deeply disturbed some members of Monroe's audience, and she never attempted anything like the role of Rose Loomis again. After Niagara, Hathaway wanted to cast Monroe in other dramatic roles, but Zanuck would not allow it. Unquestionably, he mishandled Monroe's career, which accounts, in part, for the enmity she would express against 20th Century Fox. She had a right to distrust Zanuck's judgment. Hathaway noted that Zanuck was never smart about women. Look what he did. While he had people like Marilyn, he signed up people like Bella Darby, one of several mistresses that the studio head failed to turn into stars. An angry Hathaway believed Monroe, a frustrated great artist, never got over the missed opportunities to play serious roles. You don't have to hold an inquest to find out who killed Marilyn Monroe. Those bastards in the big executive chairs killed her. Publicity for Niagara demanded that its female star engage in crude exploitation of her sexuality, and Monroe obliged by appearing at public gatherings in skin-tight costumes from her movie wardrobe. DiMaggio refused to accompany her on such occasions and bitterly protested the show she was making of herself. Hollywood columnists played up her exhibitionism, and soon newspapers and fan magazines were receiving letters criticizing her vulgar behavior. Monroe created such a sensation at a Photoplay Awards dinner that Joan Crawford publicly condemned her for conduct unbecoming an actress and a lady, besides adopting her familiar guise of injured innocence. Shortly after the release of Niagara, Monroe wrote a public letter to columnist Dorothy Kilgallen that drew a distinction between the actress and the women she played. In The Asphalt Jungle, she noted, "I played a vacuous, rich man's darling, attempting to carry herself in a sophisticated manner in keeping with her plush surroundings. I saw her as walking with a rather self-conscious slither and played it accordingly." Her succinct summing up of her characters, "In All About Eve, I was an untalented sick-show girl walking with deliberate exactness," emphasizes the intelligence and clarity of her professional work, especially in her attention to the small physical details that indicate a character's mental state. She was articulating what Chekhov taught her. Aim 67, as for Niagara, "Teehee girl I played in that was an amoral type, whose plot to kill her husband was attempted with no apparent cost to her conscience. She had been picked out of a beer parlor. She entirely lacked the social graces, and she was overdressed, overly made up, and completely wanton. The uninhibited deportment in the motel room and the walk seemed normal facets of such a character's portrayal. I honestly believe such a girl would behave in that manner." Monroe believed her acting ability entitled her to try more challenging roles. Gretchen, in Faust, for example. She had impressed Chekhov with her Cordelia in acting class, and she had pleaded with her unsympathetic studio to test her for serious roles. If Henry Hathaway had won his point, he would have cast her as Grushenka in The Brothers Karamazov. Monroe's employers were content with her popularity as evidenced in box office receipts, in fan mail, and in 2 awards she received in March of 1953. Best Young Box Office Personality, Redbook magazine, and Fastest Rising Star of 1952, Photoplay. In the spring of 1953, with Monroe's concern over craft mounting, she enrolled in mime classes at Lot Gosler's Turnabout Theater, a small repertory house in Hollywood, where Monroe had been impressed by a production of one of Anton Chekhov's plays. She wanted to work alone with Gosler, but the teacher convinced her she would benefit most by interacting with an exciting class of 10 other pupils, studying dance, mime, movement, and acting. Although reserved at first, she eventually grew comfortable with the group, and Gosler was struck by her serious and modest appearance and her exceptional talent. This talent manifested itself in an ambitious project that called for each student to develop a character from infancy to old age. In every phase, childhood, youth, maturity, the actor had to be convincing as the same person. The class was moved by Monroe's mastery of this difficult exercise in creating the full range of human behavior. In these moments of intense creativity, Monroe asserted control over her own person and filled in the gaps in her own development. Gosler's exercises complemented Chekhov's and the ideas of Mabel Ellsworth Todd, whose book Chekhov recommended as essential to the completion of an actor's training. The thinking body emphasizes that all of human life is involved in a struggle for balance, and that human beings can consciously promote and control the forces that motivate sensations and physical activity. Monroe had dramatized her life precisely as a struggle to achieve harmony. Hadn't the actress's own experience, at least since adolescence, Con F. a me 68 firmed Todd's initial pronouncement? Living, the whole body carries its meaning and tells its own story. Standing, sitting, walking, awake, or asleep. It pulls all the life up into the face of the philosopher and sends it all down the legs of the dancer. Here was a holistic view of human activity Monroe could identify with and practice, a teaching that could turn her toward therapeutic inspection of herself and away from Hollywood's mechanical magnification and distortion of what were supposed to be her better parts. Like Chekhov's approach, Todd's is integrative. Mechanically, physiologically, and psychologically, the human body is compelled to struggle for a state of equilibrium. Through a better understanding of the body's structures and functions, Todd concludes, man could better preserve his unity and cope with the world. Monroe needed to believe that the greatest source of her strength came from within, that she projected her power through a camera and onto the screen rather than the reverse, in which the camera produced, and then stripped away some personal, unreplenishable essence. Todd taught that the proper treatment of the body stimulated and rekindled its energies. Thus, Monroe's constant study of the thinking body may have been one of her primary ways of fighting the fear that films not only enhanced her self-image, but also robbed her of a more fundamental existence. Todd develops a series of exercises with appropriate illustrations designed to demonstrate the body's intrinsic balance and the way that balance can be consciously managed. Rather than simply describing what she means, Todd has the reader participate in thinking about the body, so that her prose often resembles the language of acting manuals. For example, after a passage on the spine, in which she carefully describes how human weight is balanced by the pelvis, thigh joints, and femora, she shifts to a concrete, imagistic passage that puts this knowledge about how weight is economically distributed into practice. Think down the back and up the front. Let the spine drag. Picture it extended like the dinosaur's tail, but keep the front wall of the body up. The spine travels the whole length of the back, while the whole front of the body is suspended from the spine and head, directly and indirectly, through connecting bone, muscle, and soft tissues. Thinking up the front of the body, without lifting any of its bony parts, will establish proper traction in the connecting muscles to keep the ends of all bones in the front of the body wall at proper levels for a balance of F-AIM 69 weight at their spinal attachments. Thus, tensile members at the front balance compression members at the back. Monroe confessed that she found Todd difficult reading, but she was grateful to know what to look for. And Todd's thinking up and down the body neatly paralleled Chekhov's exercises on the opening and closing of the self. Both teachers required Monroe to act, to discover for herself her own unity. Several years later, when Ralph Roberts met and became Monroe's friend, he found they shared an enthusiasm for Todd's book, from which the actress had adapted her own set of physical exercises. Acting is a matter of finding a concrete, functional way of interpreting character, of developing the right psychological gesture. Chekhov counsels, and Todd says much the same thing about learning consciously to employ the motivating picture to create the conditions for appropriate movement responses. One has to know 3 things: exact location, direction, and desire to move. When conditions are right, movement takes place. But movie-making rarely offered the right conditions. Howard Hawks persuaded Daryl Zanuck that Monroe had been miscast in Don't Bother to Knock. Her gift, Hawks assured the studio head, was for light comedy of the kind the director had in mind for his next film, Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, August 1953. Daryl, you're making realism with a very unreal girl. She's a completely storybook character, and you're trying to make real movies. When the adamant Hawks told a skeptical Zanuck that Monroe could sing, the director heard her singing to the radio. Zanuck relented in a fateful decision that virtually ensured the actress would never again be offered a dramatic role in a 20th Century Fox film. Howard Hawks and his screenwriter, Charles Lederer, grasped the evolution of Monroe's style. She was becoming self-referential. She played characters like Rose Loomis, who had no past, who needed no past. They just had to be. Hawks and his crew helped Monroe to transform herself into a self-generating phenomenon, a perpetuum mobile of desire. The allure of blondes is the way it stands apart from, is divisible from reality, just as Hawks intended. The movie begins with Lorelei Monroe and Dorothy, Jane Russell, singing "We're Just Two Little Girls from Little Rock," although no attempt is made to make them look or sound like two little girls from Little Rock. On the contrary, we get the distinct impression that Monroe and Russell are entertainers playing roles and setting scenes. We are not to take them seriously. They are on stage, backstage, FME 70, or off stage. Almost everything they do is defined by the stage setting. As soon as they begin singing or dancing, their world becomes a stage, a sea rise of scenes. When Lorelei sings to her fiancé in the ship's cabin, when Dorothy sings for the U.S. Olympic team around a swimming pool, and when both women sing, "When love goes wrong, nothing goes right," in a French cafe, crowds gather as audiences and private emotions are transformed into public performances. Dorothy, however, is allowed to at Grauman's Chinese Theater, 1953. F aims 71 slip out of her role as performer so that she can function as a person who often advises Lorelei against acting. At the very end of the film, Dorothy's differentiation from Lorelei is apparent. At their double wedding ceremony, she says, "Remember, it's all right now to say yes." Her comment implies that Lorelei may not be clear about the limits of her role, that she might just go on playing it because the role is not a means to an end marriage, but just a means, a way of being, a woman in pursuit of a rich husband, in which she has fully invested herself. More is under consideration in such a scene than Lorelei's dumbness. She is distinguished by her ability to hold on to a role, to retain nothing of herself for other times, other settings. What Lorelei is as a person is forever elusive. Sometimes she seems just plain dumb, as when she does not know the difference between a tiara and a necklace. But then she confounds her future father-in-law, Taylor Holmes, by getting the better of him in argument by frankly admitting that she can be smart when she wants to, but most men don't like it. The line was added by Monroe herself, as a script assistant's notes record. The actress wanted her audience to know that her character, like herself, was role-playing. Just how much does Lorelei know about her dumbness? On occasion, she is dumb with Dorothy. Has her role overtaken her? Somewhere apart from her role, Monroe is having fun with her audience. She is parodying her own glamour girl style. But where exactly is that parody located? Billy Wilder later exploited this ambiguous aspect of Monroe as put on in The 7-Year Itch. Throughout Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, Lorelei polishes her role, not her person. Dorothy, on the other hand, asks, "Is there anyone here for love?" She chafes against the restraints of role-playing. She wants to be herself and to be loved as herself, although she enjoys impersonating Lorelei in one scene and sees nothing wrong with scheming and stag-ing scenes for her own protection. She can dissemble, but her identity is intact, mature, even motherly in the way she guides Lorelei, whose babyish voice implies an identity that is undeveloped, despite her shrewd understanding of how to play her role. The justly famous "Diamonds Are a Girl's Best Friend" musical number elevates and consecrates the glamorous child-woman myth that envelops Lorelei Monroe throughout the film. She appears in a fetching satin dress and glossy makeup reminiscent of her most lurid publicity photographs. But there is an elegance in her long gloves and in the men in tuxedos who attend her. At the same time, the gentle way these men FME 72 carry her through the number, and the conspicuous way her dress trails what almost looks like a chick's tail feathers when she hops, indicate an infantile, unconscious nature. First glimpsed in Love Happy, that belies her cynical song about how women lose their charms looks, but rocks, diamonds, don't lose their shape. As in her nude calendar, heavy use of red throughout most of this number is obviously intended to evoke the heat of passion. and the glare of diamonds is the brilliant reward for shrewd application of that passion. In this complex mix of contradictory implications, all myths have this affinity for blending conflicting impressions, in this case cute naivete and adult seductiveness. The reds recede and a single beam, Truffaut calls it, a kind of dim church light, isolates Monroe with her arms straight above her head and her fingers outspread as she smiles and luxuriates in self-love and in the adoration of her gentlemen, who are on their knees with faces and arms uplifted. Notice how she places her hands on her chest and shakes her breasts, and how many of her gestures are self-referential, even as she plays to a worshipful audience. If Niagara first defined the visual angles of Monroe's appeal, then Gentlemen Prefer Blondes explores audience reaction to that appeal, so that the soundtrack includes a long admiring chorus Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, 1953. F aims 73 of Ooh Ooh, timed to coincide with her exaggeratedly slow side-to-side hip movements. While diamonds are a girl's best friend, burlesques Monroe as sex symbol, the number's extravagance is more than humor ooze, for it heightens her symbolic status. Such a lavish production goes well beyond anything required to embellish Lorelai's personality. The diamonds are a girl's best friend. Publicity Still, 1953, FME 74 setting, the costumes, the jewelry, the makeup, and Monroe herself are designed to be thoroughly dazzling. Every move she makes sparkles and glitters. Her voice and the accompanying music are amplified and modulated to project both the raucous response of unrepressed sexuality and her soft, mellow, caressing tones. Diamonds is a scene that in every possible way has been arranged for Monroe, so that by the end of the number she has moved in every direction and filled in every corner of the movie frame. As a result, the frame is transformed into her vehicle of self-incorporation. After Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, every film would be more or less written to play off against the person and the symbol that was Marilyn Monroe. In true Hollywood spirit, How to Marry a Millionaire, November 1953, expanded on its predecessor's formula. Since pairing Monroe with Russell worked so well, Fox supplied a bigger ensemble, this time with Monroe, Betty Grable, and Lauren Bacall all involved in catching wealthy husbands. Nunnally Johnson wrote the part of Pola, with Monroe in mind. He wanted to treat comically and compassionately what he saw as her insensitivity, her way of cutting off the world, and her self-absorption. He created a myopic Pola, who refuses to wear her glasses because she fears that she will not be able to attract the rich millionaire she is seeking. The contradictions of Pola's plight are amusing, for how can she find her rich consort without seeing him? Johnson seems to have identified a crucial aspect of Monroe's personality. She was certainly self-involved, especially during the making of this film. Lauren Bacall recalled that Monroe just had to concentrate on herself and the people who were there only for her. At the same time, she had to reach out. She would persistently try to overcome her self-absorption because it made her vulnerable, shutting her off from others and causing misunderstandings, as it did with Johnson, who thought she was stupid. So as she had done with Jane Russell, Monroe inquired about Bacall's children, her home life, her happiness. Monroe seemed envious of that aspect of my life, wistful, hoping to have it herself one day, Bacall observed. In one of the most acute synopses of Monroe's character, Bacall concluded that Monroe was afraid to trust. She made no effort for others, and yet she was nice. I think she did trust me, and like me as well as she could anyone whose life must have seemed to her so secure, so solved. Like Pola without her glasses, Monroe could not perceive people as they were. They had to be within her myopic range. She had to feel that F-aims 75 others were with her. If a given individual was not a sympathetic soul, she sensed an enemy. Jean Negulesco, her director on Millionaire, noted that it is difficult to come close to her. She becomes vague. She puts up a curtain between herself and people. In his autobiography, he recalls the sudden appearance of the hooded expression that disturbed Nada Shah Lides. With a soft-spoken voice, helpless as a sharp knife, her eyes at half-mast like a cobra watching its prey, she was a cruel child tearing off butterfly wings, gay, mean, proud, and inscrutable. Negulesco was willing to cultivate her, to explain carefully the necessity of wearing glasses. She was afraid she would be made too unattractive by mixing personal and professional relations in the course of having several dinners wit. Her, he made a point of his interest in her as a person, and like Karger, Lides, and Chekhov, He discussed art and literature to establish a rapport with her. He even painted her portrait, pointing out various artistic techniques. She was intrigued by his discussion of post-impressionist artists and asked sensible questions about them. She was slow to absorb his direction and hated script changes, yet her stamina over very long work hours and her total concentration impressed him. Several years later, he remembered how she had such a right sense of knowing the character she was playing, the way to enter a scene, to hold singular attention as the scene developed, the way to end a scene, so that no other actor existed around her. There were times, however, when it seemed virtually impossible to mediate between Monroe's self-absorption and the corporate film world of cast and crew. During one trying afternoon on the set of Millionaire, Monroe kept blowing one take after another, fluffing her lines, or forgetting them. Everyone was tired and tense in the late afternoon, and Johnson, sensing growing resentment and feeling sorry for Monroe, prepared to console her as she compulsively consulted a mirror to adjust her makeup. He told her she was doing well. There was nothing to worry about. She looked up from the mirror and seemed puzzled, for, according to Johnson, it was clear that she let him and Negulesco do the worrying. All she cared about was her own part. A publicity still from Millionaire elaborates on Monroe's tendency to pose for herself. The mirror shot has her in a typical position, with her right arm parallel to her face and her forearm bent backward as if to suggest, once again, a self-caress. The four-part mirror reflects 4 different angles of the same pose, with each angle gradually turning the star's face from distant profile to a 3/4 open view. The photograph NF A Me 76 closes Monroe within the panels of her own appeal. Her images revolve around her person, or is it the person, who is smiling dreamily, revolving around the images? With the aid of a mirror, one pose begets 4 diff as Pola in How to Marry a Millionaire, 1953. F aims 77 Farrant images. This is precisely the sort of self-amplification that Monroe seems to be enjoying in the photograph. In the film, however, the scene in which this mirror appears is quite brief, and Pola only uses the mirror to check that everything is in the right place. Millionaire does not explore Monroe's interesting polarities of self-commitment and self-to-world involvement. Pola is too naive, too limited in experience, and cannot approach Monroe's complexity. Or, stated another way, Monroe's psychological myopia is played for laughs by giving Pola a physical disability and various sight gags. Pola runs into walls and takes the wrong airplane, and Monroe is very skillful and funny performing the physical business of her role. It was characteristic of her to call on Chekhov to help with the timing of her comic scenes. Because Pola moves blindly through the world, she cannot see herself, a point that is vividly made during her encounter with Freddie Denmark, David Wayne, who wears glasses. Sitting next to her on a plane, he observes her reading a book upside down. "Why don't you wear glasses?" he asks. At first, she denies her need for them, then hesitantly admits to her blindness when Denmark freely confesses his own reluctance to wear glasses until the day he said hello to 3 different men to whom he owed Mon I. Denmark is forthright and obviously comfortable wearing glasses. He encourages Pola to wear hers and confides that he thinks with or without glasses she is quite a strudel. Monroe plays Pola's reactions perfectly. Waves of panic move across Pola's face as she tentatively puts her glasses on. Denmark's response is immediate, positive, and decisive. He tells her the glasses give her a certain difference or distinction, and Pola glows with a happy sense of importance she has never felt before. She is directed to a sense of self-worth, just as Monroe sometimes depended on the sensitive guidance of others for belief in her own strength. But while Pola's salvation is accidental, Monroe sought and perceived ways of building a better self. Pola is passive. Monroe, who could retard her progress through inertia and timidity, was nevertheless dynamic and inventive in working out her own career. Part of Monroe's problem was that many of her directors and the studios that hired them expected her to play a persona. This was the How Ard Hawks approach: capitalize on Monroe's physical features and mental quirks. Let her play those. Questions about motivation just got in the way and sounded pretentious to professionals concerned with the big picture. That she could be so serious about her comedies was a con F a Me 78 tradiction in terms. Yet Monroe's demand that her parts yield more than her directors expected is precisely why her work survives. She endowed her performances with a subtlety that is apparent mainly in retrospect, when so much more is known about her preparations for the camera. So much of what an audience could see of her depended on the cultural climate, the times being what they were. Critic Molly Haskell suggests in From Reverence to Rape, the treatment of women in the movies. If she hadn't existed, we would have had to invent her, and we did, in a way. She was the 50s fiction, the lie that a woman has no sexual needs, that she is there to cater to or enhance a man's needs. Marilyn Monroe ended the year 1953 at number 5 in the top 10 list of box office stars. Both Lauren Bacall and Betty Grable had been gracious about the younger actress's star power, the latter saying to her, "Honey, I've had it. Go get yours. It's your turn now." Not in Howard Hawks's class as a director, Negulesco produced an inferior but popular film that proved Monroe could perform basically the same character again and again, no matter who directed her. If this knowledge was comforting to the studio, it was disturbing to Monroe. If she paid even less attention to most directors in her future roles, she did so, in part, because she believed that she was the only one looking out for her talent. And yet, in Monroe's public appearances, she seemed all too ready to rely on male directors of her life. She called on decisive Joe DiMaggio for support when she confronted the tyrannical Otto Preminger during the filming of River of No Return, May 1954. She had torn a knee ligament while struggling to meet the demanding director's schedule. DiMaggio arrived with a doctor to shore up both Monroe's mental and physical defenses, which were crumbling rapidly. Or were they? According to Shel Leigh Winters, Monroe may have staged her accident to scare Preminger and her studio and to create sympathy for herself. After her accident, Preminger became amenable and DiMaggio ardent. She and DiMaggio had a lover's quarrel before the start of the film, but sometime during filming, they decided to marry. In River of No Return, Monroe plays a dancey hall girl, a whore with a heart of gold. As Joan Mellon puts it, it is a poorly conceived movie, as Monroe knew, but that does not excuse her stilted, mannered speech, which is completely out of character, and which Preminger blamed on Natasha Lyonne's emphasis on enunciation. Monroe is persuasive in her dance hall songs. Lot Gosler helped her with them, and even compel Ling when she sings to a young boy, Tommy Rettig. In such scenes, she Ames 79 appears utterly at ease, charming, and at one with the Western setting and her role. But her character, Kay, is passive. She has been mishandled by disreputable men and collaborated in their shady dealings. With her poor background, she has had few opportunities to be as good as she should be. Although she does evolve emotionally and exhibits some feistiness when she makes Matt Calder, Robert Mitchum, abandon his preconceived notions about her dancey hall career and acknowledge that she is capable of change. She seems less than the real woman Molly Haskell professes to see, however, and at the end of the film called her leader River of No Return, 1954. A Me-80 ally carries her off to become his wife and the mother of his young son. All she needed, the film implies, was one good, clean, hearty, honest man to set her straight. Monroe dismissed River of No Return as a Z-Western. Preminger seems too entranced with exploiting the widescreen possibilities of cinemascope, filming stirring scenes with Mitchum and Monroe on a raft in the rapids, so that spectacle overwhelms the drama and character development. Preminger and Monroe fought over Natasha Lyonne's presence on the set, but Monroe appealed to Zanuck, who now felt he had to make certain concessions to a major star and took her side. On January 14, 1954, shortly after the completion of River of No Return, Monroe did indeed marry a good, clean, hearty, trustworthy hero, Joe DiMaggio, the Yankee Clipper. The marriage was a sensational event. The couple found themselves on the covers of magazines, in the headlines of newspapers, and at the top of gossip columns all over the world. Monroe's studio had suspended her for refusing to do pink tights, which she regarded as a Betty Grable retread. But then it revoked the suspension and sent congratulations to the honeymooning couple in Japan. Joltin' Joe was her slugger, Monroe told the press. Their marriage was another chapter in the American dream. Two of the beloved national pastimes, sports and movies, had been conjoined, the merger of two worlds. Life, January 25, called it. When they were en route to Japan, an army officer invited Monroe to entertain the troops in Korea. Without DiMaggio's endorsement, Monroe headed off to respond in person to the headlines, which elevated her in the public consciousness to a level she had never imagined possible. She had to improvise and act quickly, since she had not come to Japan with performing in mind, but she had no great problem with this change of plans. She took a few songs from her films and choreographed a personal triumph. One soldier, riding home to his mother on February 25, 1954, described Monroe's appearance in a low-cut, sheathed dress of purple glittery sort of material. "She is certainly beautiful." When she appeared on the stage, there was just a sort of gasp from the audience. A single gasp multiplied by the 12,000 soldiers present was quite a gasp. The poor sound system did not matter. All that mattered was that she was there, the soldier emphasized. UN-like lesser entertainers. After the show, she autographed, chatted, and posed for pictures. Then through all the trucks and jeeps, she rode perched on top of the seat of her jeep, smiling and AIM-81 waving. I think it was pretty wonderful that she came to Korea at all, and doubly so that she came to the divisions that have been so long on the line, and bypassed the easy duty in Seoul, Incheon, and the southern cities. Altogether, she entertained approximately 100,000 troops over 10 performances. Pictures of her singing and dancing in sub-zero temperatures were published all over the world. By all accounts, she put on a remarkably poised and witty act, quite a feat for an actress who was not used to live audiences. Monroe returned to DiMaggio in Japan suffering from pneumonia, but the cheers she had evoked warmed her immeasurably, even if this kind of fame could not fulfill her permanently. In my story, she recalls that backstage before her first performance she could hear music playing and a roar of voices trying to drown it out. An excited officer told her that she would have to go on ahead of schedule. "I don't think we can hold them any longer. They're throwing rocks on the stage." The repeated roar of her name demonstrated that her identity had an echo and an impact. She told Sidney Skalski, "I felt I belonged. For the first time in my life, I had the feeling that the people seeing me were accepting me and Korea, 1954. A me 82 liking me. This is what I've always wanted, I guess." That's why, without realizing the full meaning of what I was saying, I told Joe that for the first time I felt like a movie star. At her last performance, Monroe told an audience of cheering soldiers that they made her feel for the first time in her life completely accepted. It had always been what she wanted, but now she wanted to start a family. A family comes before a career. That was certainly what Joe DiMaggio wanted to hear, and perhaps even what Monroe, free for the moment from the pressures of filmmaking, believed at the time. Monroe was speaking, of course, to men who taped pictures of her in their lockers and who read Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper that frequently published photographs of her. She was, as Lois Banner notes, a Cold War symbol of American freedom and the major pinup of the war, 1950-1953. Much of her fan mail came from servicemen who would be returning home to resume the family life she imagined for herself. These men were thrilled to see her, which perhaps accounts for the way she formulated her pleasure at the feeling that people seeing me were accepting me and liking me. Without the apparatus of a studio, without the troubling setups, directors, coaches, cast, and crew, and with no worries about her lines or the need to hide in her dressing room, she had made a success of herself. In Korea, Monroe was able to fuse herself with her film and photographic image, to be exactly what her audience had supposed her to be. In Korea, she became one with the imprint of her fame. Chapter 6. Half-Life, April-November 1954. Who is she? Who does she think she is? Marilyn Monroe. Like professional athletes, most stars have short careers. The exception is the actor, a Gary Cooper or Cary Grant, who can surmount the limitations of formulaic films. And Hollywood has been especially tough on women. Even legends like Joan Crawford, Katharine Hepburn, and Bette Davis have succumbed to box office poison periods and have had to stage comebacks. Exceptions aside, stars could malfunction, to use Janine Basinger's word in The Star Machine. Like a piece of equipment, the star could wear out, failing to perform at peak levels. If some of the malfunctions had been assigned better roles or better advisors, or had come along in a different decade, or not been compared unfavorably to already established stars, or hadn't run away from it, bungled it, or even died, what might have happened? Basinger asks. Her book is replete with examples of actresses who almost made it, who had gifts similar to Monroe's, but never found their niche, their piece of the Hollywood market. It was a fraught business, keeping oneself in proper condition. June DiMaggio noticed that Monroe was always worrying about her weight. Monroe also had to watch out for studio missteps. As she learned the business, she also learned to distrust Fox executives and directors who might not be able to use her the right way. Approaching her mid-twenties, Monroe also knew that at best she could continue as the blonde for perhaps another 5 to 10 years before Hollywood would find a replacement. Leading men like Clark Gable and Jimmy Stewart could continue to play romantic parts into their early 60s. But Hollywood did not be half-live 84 leave audiences would accept an older woman as the main love interest. In the 1950s, the trajectory for women on screen and off began with a brief career and ended in marriage. Certainly, this was the scenario that Joe DiMaggio counted on and that Grace Kelly, Monroe's contemporary, achieved in her fairy tale marriage to Monaco's Prince Rainier, rumored to have been interested in Monroe before he settled on Kelly. This era of the feminine mystique posited a world in which careers, higher education, and the professions were open to women, but also quickly sealed off even for female college graduates, who anticipated working for only a few years at most before marrying and starting family lives. As Betty Friedan put it in her highly influential book, the feminine mystique says that the highest value and the only commitment for women is the fulfillment of their own femininity. Women made a mistake when they tried to compete like men. They were going against their natures. Women could do the job, to be sure, but at great cost to the nurturing, maternal aspects of their nature. Even a highly ambitious poet like Sylvia Plath did not want to be known as a career girl. Monroe, devoted to her career, was nevertheless susceptible to this basically Freudian depiction of the unfulfilled woman. She believed in psychotherapy and participated in some form of analysis for most of her life. Although much has been written about the childhood traumas that contributed to her mental upsets, cultural determinants played a significant role in how she thought about herself as a woman and an actress. She never relinquished her commitment to acting as key to developing a sound identity, and yet marriage and childbearing remained just as crucial to her well-being. Her culture told her so. Monroe performed in a patriarchal system, with Daryl Zanuck exercising the privileges of an authority figure, and Joe DiMaggio stamping her with his brand. To be sure, Monroe resisted this model of male domination, hence her fights with both Zanuck and DiMaggio. But she had very few female role models to suggest how she would establish her own authority, a point that Gloria Steinem, Donald Spoto, and Lois Banner explore in their biographies of Monroe. Friedan had Monroe in mind when she wrote that the actress was the one type of career woman that women's magazines endorsed. But their role model was not the female star of the 1930s and 1940, both comely and competitive, a Rosalind Russell or a Barbara Stanwyck, but instead a docile and rather dense figure like those Monroe and her imitators, Jane Mansfield and Mamie Van Doren, for example, impersonated. HLF Lif E85 so long as women's magazines and Hollywood defined women solely in terms of their sexuality, their desire to do more with their lives, and careers seemed oddly misplaced. Thus, articles ridiculing, or at the very least doubting Monroe's commitment to acting and her quest for serious roles were not seen as demeaning, but as part of mainstream thinking about Monroe's place in the culture. When Betty Friedan questioned the Smith College graduates of 1959, she found many of them conflicted about their futures. Many were engaged and seemed relieved to have marriage solve the dilemma of what to do next, but they also seemed vaguely resentful that they would not be putting to use what they had learned at Smith, even though there was much unconvincing talk about continuing work by becoming involved in neighborhood and community activities. Those graduates who were not engaged to be married seemed equally at sea, not sure what they might do in terms of careers and somewhat envious of their engaged contemporaries, who seemed to have solved the problem of what to do with their lives. In truth, Friedan suggests, neither group of graduates seemed content with its choices, although they were less than candid about their feelings when talking together with Friedan. One of them took the author aside to say that what Friedan had been told publicly masked the anxiety these women felt about their limited options. In this regard, Marilyn Monroe, for all her fame and success, confronted the same narrow field of prospects, as would become apparent in due course when she began to protest the career her studio projected for her. In one sense, no one understood Marilyn Monroe's plight better than Joe DiMaggio, a world-class athlete who hobbled into his 30s with a foot injury that shortened his career. Although like Monroe, he continued to perform at the highest levels. Up to 1953, DiMaggio had put up with the demands of Monroe's career, realizing how badly she wanted to succeed. But by the end of 1953, she had proved her point, or so it seemed to him. He did not believe that Hollywood would give her the opportunity to perform in a breakout role, one that would shatter the dumb, blonde image. And he had no respect for Hollywood per se, regarding it as an industry full of phonies. The best she could do was swing a few big deals and then get out. He had never liked the publicity that came with becoming a star. Not for himself, and certainly not for the woman he wanted to marry. DiMaggio, very much a man of his era, believed that a home and family would be the best solution to Monroe's desire to fulfill herself as a half-life E86 woman. In this regard, he seemed no different from Freud himself. As Frieden points out in The Feminine Mystique, Freud implored his future wife to withdraw from the strife of unmarried life and seek refuge in the calm, uncompetitive activity of my home. He married his adored darling, expecting her to have no identity other than loved wife. A patient DiMaggio thought that Monroe would eventually tire of the studio grind. Making films is an arduous process, demanding long hours on movie sets, waiting and waiting and waiting for camera setups, sound checks, makeup, lighting, an incredible concatenation of machinery and techniscience that requires enormous physical and mental concentration. When he visited her on movie lots, he noticed how tired and upset she would become. Was it really worth all this pain and struggle? He asked her, for all her stardom, she was still a contract player, which meant she had to take the roles assigned to her, no matter what she thought of them, and virtually punch a clock like any low-level employee. DiMaggio's sense of dignity deeply appealed to Monroe. She wanted as much for herself. To him, her subservient roles both on screen and in relation to the studio were degrading. By and large, most biographers have focused on the tensions between this couple because of DiMaggio's insistence that Monroe quit her career. But a corollary factor in their mutual attraction was his keen understanding of what she was due as a moneymaker for the studio. A hard bargainer himself, and no stranger to contract disputes, he counseled Monroe not to sell herself short. The couple continued to quarrel about her career, but even so she drew on DiMaggio's strength and his demands that she stand up for what she deserved. They understood one another as products of the Depression, both coming from poor families and yet fulfilling the grandest of American dreams. DiMaggio's fame, especially at this juncture in Monroe's career, was crucial. Sitting next to Mr. DiMaggio, Monroe said after their first date, was like sitting next to a peacock with its tail spread. That's how noticeable you were. The media attention helped to establish her iconic status as the consort of the national pastime's heralded hero. A mystique had built up around the taciturn DiMaggio, making him the perfect foil for Monroe. The flamboyant actress who could act the demure date with him, a role movie studios loved because it allowed them to present their stars as being not so different from their fans. Marilyn Monroe wanted, it turned out, just what every other young woman wanted in America: a husband to take care of her. If her films projected an image of a woman hot LF E87 who was seemingly available to every man in real life, this availability could be balanced by showing that she belonged, like most women in America, to one man. Such mixed messages were the very stuff of Hollywood's appeal to millions of moviegoers. Beginning in the late 1920s, with the establishment of fan magazines and gossip columns about Hollywood stars that paradoxically promoted both the stars' glamorous and yet supposedly conventional, morally acceptable lives. DiMaggio had a reserve so deep and so profound a desire to be untouched by the world's interest in him that he fascinated Monroe, who could be needy and demanding. How relaxing to be in the company of a man so self-contained. And yet he wanted Marilyn Monroe. This need gave him poignancy. Journalist Jimmy Cannon, who became a DiMaggio confidant insofar as anyone could actually serve in such a role, called him the loneliest man he had ever met. That such a man should crave Monroe's company when he found it so difficult to share himself with others made him especially appealing to her. Unlike nearly every other man she met, This was one who could not possibly want to exploit her. Indeed, he promised to do just the opposite, to take her away from a world that overexposed her. And yet, without that public recognition and acclaim, Monroe seemed restless, anxious, and committed to resuming her film career. In the spring of 1954, just after their honeymoon trip to Japan, Monroe and DiMaggio began quarreling. They were in San Francisco, his hometown, where he apparently took up a semi-bachelor routine, while she waited impatiently to resume her career in There's No Business Like Show Business, a hackneyed musical she agreed to do only because in return she was promised the role of the girl in The 7-Year Itch, a film adaptation of a hit Broadway play directed by Billy Wilder, one of Hollywood's greatest talents. Monroe also anticipated a new contract that would significantly raise her pay to the $100,000 per picture that her agent Charles Feldman demanded from Fox. That she still had no creative control over her work dismayed her, and so did DiMaggio's reaction, because he thought she should be content with a raise. He never did appreciate her devotion to the art of acting, and his skepticism about her abilities became a factor in the rapid disintegration of their marriage. Although DiMaggio grudgingly moved to Hollywood, he was not on the movie set to give Monroe support, as he had been for part of River of No Return. She, in turn, devoted little time to home life and conferred continually with Natasha Lydes, whom DiMaggio detested. Indeed, Dior Halfliff E88, Ing Show Business Monroe, began to encircle herself with an entourage that would cater to her on subsequent movie sets. DiMaggio, no doubt, felt excluded from this group of followers, as did some of Monroe's co-workers, who came to deplore her menagerie of helpers, preferring to believe that she would have been better off relying on her own strengths rather than using others to shore up her weaknesses. In show business, Monroe plays Vicky, a hat-check girl who aspires to be an actress. Like Monroe's, Vicky's lowly beginnings provoke P.O.P., like Tim Donahue Donald O'Connor, who will become her boyfriend, to scoff at her pretensions. She is pictured in front of a mirror. There's no business like show business, publicity still, 1954. Ha LF Liff E89 posing for herself, rocking her head, and her lack of inflection, her way of pronouncing every word with equal emphasis. As in her line, "This gentleman was just leaving," make her a wooden, uninspired copy of Monroe's earlier film characters. It is as if one of the well-worn pages of her studio biography had simply been inserted into the film. Her first musical number, After You Get What You Want You Don't Want It, is an embarrassingly bad imitation of Diamonds Are a Girl's Best Friend. Although she sings the number well, so that the song's wry sensibility is sophisticatedly poised in her warm, delicate phrasing, she is forced to throw herself at the various couples seated at nightclub tables, while she eyes men and turns her body at various angles to make her legs or her breasts more prominent. She also uses a familiar gesture from Diamonds, placing her hands on her chest and shaking her breasts, but the scene as a whole fails to sustain the rapport between her person and her audience that the earlier film establishes. There is something very static and remote about this scene, even though Monroe is maneuvered into filling the movie frame in ways similar to those employed in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. In a still often reproduced from this scene, she is captured with her arms extended upward, and with her hands bent at the There's No Business Like Show Business, 1954. Half lift E90 wrists and turn toward each other over her head, so that once again she frames herself in her own appeal, emphasizing her smiling, open-mouthed self-intoxication. Unlike her avatar, Lorelei Lee, Vicky is slightly on the set of Show Business, 1954. Ha LF Liff E91 freakish, a bizarrely angled bird with too much plumage, too much frip-purry that turns her into a prop, a thing on which to attach items of sexual provocation. Note the studio's description of the costume Monroe wears in this still. A high-necked, long-sleeved, slit-long-skirted evening gown of white illusion net over flesh crepe, with white beaded lace appliques embroidered in strategic places. Monroe's Vicky is essentially a character to gawk at, as she is in the other big production number, Heat Wave, where her repertory of gestures is severely limited and the camera often concentrates on her crotch and other body parts. The film never attempts to integrate the vulgarian of these musical scenes with the poor naive Vicky, who is seen in short episodes with her boyfriend Tim. Somehow, more or less like Monroe, Vicky has become a rising star after having been on her own since she was 15. This cheap use of Monroe's, by then already well-known biography, does nothing to enhance the characterization of Vicky, but it does demonstrate how Monroe was forced into dull, formulaic work. It is difficult to appreciate her presence in this terrible film. Her role is negligible, and overshadowed by such musical comedy stars as Ethel Merman and Dan Daly. Monroe was ill throughout the making of Show Business, suffering from ailments variously reported as anemia, a low-grade virus, and just sheer physical exhaustion. Rose Steinberg Wapner remembered Monroe on the set going over the same scene again and again, until Wapner could see physical weakness in her eyes. It is the only film in which she observed this kind of wee-wryness and dissipation of creative energy in Monroe. Reports of Monroe's excessive drinking, addiction to sleeping pills and amphetamines, and her need to consult a psychiatrist first surfaced during the making of this film. Not all of these reports are verifiable, yet it is apparent that she was under more stress than in any previous picture or period of her life. Her dress designer, Billy Travilla, remembered Monroe crying and expressing fears about losing her mind. "My brains are leaving me. I think I'm going crazy," she told him. DiMaggio was extremely jealous and, according to some of Monroe's friends, physically abusive, although his niece, June DiMaggio, insists he expressed his anger by giving Monroe and others the silent treatment. He suspected she was having an affair with her voice coach, Hal Schieffer, who later admitted as much. Like Fred Karger, Schieffer did not allow his feelings for her to interfere with the cultivation of her talent, and the intimacy between him and Monroe did not develop until several months half-lif E92 after their film work ceased. Their affair, in fact, was an ordeal for him and contributed to a suicide attempt he barely survived. Monroe's faltering marriage made work difficult, as Susan Strasberg observed on a visit. Marilyn was perspiring heavily and kept falling out of step. Joe DiMaggio was on the set that day, so she was under additional tension. He hated the film and appeared on the set only this one time, refusing to be photographed with his wife and hurting her feelings when he agreed to posing in a two-shot with Ethel Merman. Monroe slipped in the middle of a complicated step and fell soundly on her backside. Tacking a break, she came over to us, still embarrassed from her fall. On the set of Show Business, Monroe seemed to flounder. "She didn't appear to have any guidelines," Wapner remarked. In retrospect, it seems as though a phase of the actress's career was over, and that she would have to find some way to avoid these base imitations of herself. Monroe had already begun to consider alternatives to Hollywood. In September of 1953, she had met the photographer Milton Green, who began to encourage her to join him in the formation of her own film production company. And she had probably heard from Elia Kazan and others about the Actors Studio in New York, so when on the set of Show Business she finally met Paula Strasberg, the wife of the studio's eminent head, Monroe declared, "I've heard so much about your husband. I think he's wonderful. I've always dreamed of studying acting with Mr. Strasberg." In sum, Monroe had already made tentative contacts that made her move to the East less abrupt and less arbitrary than it appeared to the press who reported on it in her day. When Monroe went to New York on September 9, 1954, to do location shooting for the 7-Year Itch, she resumed meeting with Green and began confiding in him and his wife, Amy, about her career and her troubles with her husband. She was also keeping in touch with Arthur Miller by telephone, writing a few letters to him, and occasionally visiting Brooklyn, where he lived. She particularly enjoyed the heterogeneous life of urban streets and spoke to reporters about retiring to Brooklyn. Apparently, Monroe was meditating on a break with Hollywood long before she actually took up permanent residence in New York. The 7-Year Itch may have represented a kind of culmination for her, one that made a break easier to contemplate, for her role in the film epitomizes the screen persona that had first been fully manifested in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. Her character in Itch, the girl, is given no name until near the end of the film, when her would-be lover, Richard Ha LF Liff E93 Sherman, Tom Ewell, says in swaggering fashion to another male that maybe the girl is Marilyn Monroe. Audiences still explode with laughter at this in joke, just as audiences roared their approval in 1955. In Itch, Monroe plays at being herself, parodying the screen persona she has become. Many of the girl's lines are similar to Lorelei Lee's. For instance, Lorelei could easily have spoken the girl's line about knowing how to identify a piece of classical music. T here is no vocal. When the girl does her commercial for Dazzle-Dent toothpaste, she couches her words and her figure in the simpering attitudes of Monroe's early publicity photographs. Better than any movie up to this point, Itch exemplifies the range of Monroe's appeal. In Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, she is paired at various times with a precocious young boy possessed of a mature voice, a wimpy young man with an adolescent outlook, and an old man with some sexual vigor left in him. In Show Business, an ordinary-looking song and dance man charms her. In Itch, she fills in the middle ground of her democratic attractiveness by becoming the object of a middle-aged, middle-class male's sexual fantasies. Sherman works for a publishing house, capitalizing on the advent of mass-market paperbacks, just then becoming a staple of the book trade. The 7-Year Itch, 1955. Half-Life E94, even classics like The Scarlet Letter are given lurid covers that previously had been the province of pornography. Sherman's firm is about to publish an academic psychological study of the 7-year itch in the middle-aged male, with a sensationalized cover. Of course, the film exaggerates this trend toward the sexualization of everything, but Hollywood, the cosmetics industry, and the entire business of beautification burgeoned in the 1950s, as women gave themselves home permanence and bought padded bras that brought their figures in line with the likes of Monroe, Jane Russell, and Jane Mansfield. The complaint that one woman might make about a rival flaunting her sexuality, who does she think she is? Marilyn Monroe, was common enough by the mid-1950s. Monroe arrives as the girl everyone can enjoy. She is no longer someone else's mistress, the asphalt jungle, all about Eve, someone else's secretary, as young as you feel, monkey business, or someone else's wife or girlfriend. We're not married, Niagara, show business. Indeed, the girl has no boyfriends or bosses, and she does not see herself in competition with other women. She is readily available to even the most passive male. Sherman, like the moviegoer, only has to dream about her in order for her to appear. She remains accessible even after Sherman blunders badly in his seduction of her. She is, in short, the perfect plaything, a live-ing doll, as one of the characters in the film keeps insisting. You're just elegant, the girl tells Sherman at a strategic moment when he is feeling particularly inept and unattractive, and she earnestly hopes that his wife will value him more highly. She constantly strokes his middle-aged ego. She tells him he has powerful thumbs as he pops the champagne cork, which is clearly a not-so-covert allusion to his wanting to pop her. A girl who is as effervescent as the champagne she loves to dip her potato chips in. Similarly, his twitching thumb is a barely disguised token of what is no doubt. The audience is invited to imagine his other pulsating member, the strong sexual drive he tries to suppress in loyalty to his marriage of 7 years. The girl delivers puns on phallic penetration without a flicker of self-consciousness, and she is oblivious to Sherman's, grown-up, leer about her interesting point of view. She seems infinitely innocent and willing to follow every turn of Sherman's erratic stop-and-go romancing. The celebrated skirt-blowing scene is, of course, the finest instance of a Monroe character's ability to suggest simultaneously both childlike pleasure and sexual delight. Photographs of Monroe straddling a subway, grating with her dress forced high above her thighs by the rush of air coming from below, appeared in magazines and newspapers around the hot LF E95 world. It seemed that she was caught in a spontaneous moment of joy and relief on a hot city summer night, and that moment was suspended above ground and defined from nearly every conceivable angle. She was shot in profile, straight on, with her head titled backward, forward, or turned 3/4 of the way toward the camera. In one pose, she is holding her dress, so that it fans out in front of her, revealing her panties, and fans out behind her, as she twists her neck in ecstasy. In another pose, her whole body surges forward, with one of her fingers seemingly shooting in the direction of the camera that is shooting her. The self-reflexiveness of such shots does not carry over into the filmed scene. On the contrary, it seems subdued and understated after one has become accustomed to the plethora of poses available in the photographs. In the film, the forced air lifts her dress rather sedately above her knees, although in a second shot the camera fastens on and moves along the surface of the subway grating, as if tracking the gust of air shooting up from a speeding train, and simulating the rush of feeling exemplified in the girl's lifted spirits and skirt. Monroe is something else besides an object of male fantasy. or an airy symbol of a nature goddess almost able to raise herself in her magical skirt above the grimy subway, grating to fly as high as her soaring orgasm of delight. She also plays the girl as a woman who is herself. That is to say, there is a matter-of-factness about her, a down-to-earth directness reminiscent of Clara Bow. This aspect of the girl disconcerts Sherman. She is kind to him, but she makes it clear that his air conditioner, in this hot city summer, is one of his main attractions. She is less impressed by his efforts to be suave than she is by his genuine modesty and self-effacement. What he excites most in her is compassion and sincere respect for his homely strengths. She clearly indicates that she rebuffs good-looking, conceited young men who try to overwhelm her with their high opinions of themselves. Although one could interpret her preference for Sherman as another one of his middle-aged projections, there is a solidity to the girl, a sureness that surprises him and makes it unlikely that she is just his fantasy. In fact, her lack of embarrassment about her motives and her charming way of conveying them to him make her seem, at least in this respect, not at all dumb, but instead more mature than Sherman. Take, for example, the scene in which she discovers that by simply pulling up a few nails, she can open a trapdoor that leads immediately to a set of stairs that descend from her apartment into his. As she reaches the landing, she pauses with a hammer poised delicately in one hand and half-lift E96, a toothbrush in the other, and sweetly announces, "You know what? We can do this all summer." The camera holds on her wide-eyed child's face as she subtly shifts to a narrow-eyed adult concentration, conveying an unmistakable sexual innuendo, to which audiences respond with both laughter and the verbal asides that one expects in connection with double entendre. Such minutely perceptible modulations in the way Monroe plays the girl, and the camera's facility in fastening on her long enough to suggest that more is there than the initial impression of naivete, has the audience, rather than the actors, doing double takes. Monroe's char actor is as infinitely suggestive as she is innocent. As usual, the publicity surrounding this Monroe film virtually obliterated any consideration of her talent. Instead, primarily because of the skirt-blowing scene, she was treated as having shown more of herself than ever before. The filming of this celebrated scene at 2:30 a.m. on September 10, 1954, in New York City, attracted a crowd variously estimated to have been between 1,000 and 4,000 people, who watched Monroe's skirt fly up 15 times as the scene was rehearsed. DiMaggio had arrived 2 days earlier and drew the attention of some fans and the press. Amid shouts of "higher" and "hurrah," as the wind-blowing machine puffed his wife's skirt over her head, DiMaggio retreated in silent anger. Monroe herself seemed taken aback at the spectacle Billy Wilder had made of her. She is reported to have asked him if he was going to show the more lurid shots to his male cronies. Around 4:00 a.m., Monroe returned to her hotel room. DiMaggio arrived somewhat later. Evidently, they quarreled over her night's work, for some shouting and scuffling was overheard by other hotel residents nearby, followed by hysterical weeping. The next day, DiMaggio departed for California, and Monroe remained heavily sedated. When she arrived on the set of The 7-Year Itch, her bruises had to be covered with makeup. As awful as DiMaggio's attack may seem, in the 1950s and in earlier generations, wife-beating was rarely reported as a crime, and many wives put up with physical abuse. Barbara Stanwyck, one of Hollywood's most stalwart stars, suffered repeated beatings from her first husband, Frank Fay. After he knocked her down in front of their son, she decided to divorce him. Like Monroe, Stanwyck had been attracted to an older man she thought of as her protector, until he asserted his male prerogative. As to why she spent years in an abusive marriage, Stanwyck explained, "Gee, it's swell to have somebody to stand between you and the world." It was not unusual for Hollywood films of the 1940s and 1950s HLF E97 to include jokes about wife-beating. Rita Hayworth, Hollywood's reigning sex symbol in the 1940s, tolerated physical cruelty in her marriage to Dick Haymes during a period when the very concept of domestic violence was unfamiliar and seldom addressed with intervention by public authorities. That Monroe responded quickly and decisively to DiMaggio's aggression suggests how determined she was to change direction. Less than a month later, on October 4, her attorney would announce the end of her marriage, and she would proceed to finish Itch without the breakdowns, tardiness, and falterings that now were customary on her sets. Monroe remained adamant about her decision to dissolve the marriage and seemed just as determined to demonstrate her commitment to her career. She also seemed intent on exploiting every opportunity for publicity. Sidney Skalski, present during the preparations for Monroe's appearance before the press to announce her divorce, recalls how Jerry Jaisler, her attorney, acted like a movie director, explaining the mood he wanted. Skalski was to offer his support, while the attorney held Monroe tightly in his grip. The newsreel footage of the announcement Certain Lie suggests a staged, melodramatic scene in which Monroe's sorrow is made public in the way Jaisler planned. She walks out of the house, faces the microphones, begins to speak, falters, and wells up with tears. As her attorney supports her, she slowly shakes her head from side to side, as if to signal that she cannot trust herself to say anything. Why did Monroe face the press and cameras in this carefully framed way? Because she learned to view her life in terms of camera setups. Her real distress over the breakup with DiMaggio had to be used as another scene in her script. Another eyewitness account of Monroe's preparations for the press has her numb from emotional fatigue. New floods of tears ruined her mascara every few minutes, so Marilyn was obliged to spend much of her time in front of a mirror in her second-floor bedroom. She was forced to put a face on her emotions, to repair her image in the mirror repeatedly, because that was the only way she knew how to put herself together. Monroe was living with the consequences of having become a performing self, the kind of self for which, Shelley Winters remarks, reality has to be heightened by turning one's private life inside out. Sometimes I'll be weeping, and I'll look in the mirror, and I say, why do I twist up my face? I'm right in the middle of agony, and I'm sort of remembering how I got to this feeling of agony. I'm not sure that this is good, in fact. I think it's bad. But maybe you can't help it if you're an half-life E98 actor. The actor's only instrument is herself, and she has to be on view for every occasion and know how to project her life into her roles. As a result, much of her experience is filtered and stored up for public exposure. Actors conduct constant raids on their own lives. For Monroe, the accretion of photographs, films, and mirror images tended to prevent her from being direct with herself. Working with her life had come to resemble working with the paste-up she had done for show business, in which she recorded the Heat Wave song 25 times for one of her singing coaches, Ken Darby, who took the 25 pieces of tape home with him and cut them up and put them together so that she had the proper phrasing in each part of the song, and could then recreate it in the studio. Given Monroe's superb command of Hollywood publicity, it came as a shock a few months later when she announced that she was leaving 20th Century Fox and moving to New York. Almost immediately, however, her move was suspected to be a publicity ploy, and few people seemed to appreciate that she had become so saturated with her own stardom that she felt stymied. Although Monroe would indulge in various kinds of publicity maneuvers for the rest of her career, never again would her life be quite as public as it has been during the 7-year itch and her divorce from DiMaggio. In her last years, she was, in a way that anticipated the Beatles, in revolt against herself or against the popular personality she had created. Like the Beatles, she had served a long apprenticeship in which she had worked much harder than others, reaching for the same kind of recognition. Like John Lennon, she voiced the infantile longing behind every star's obsession. Why didn't anybody notice me? She shared the Beatles' talent for turning everything into an event, a spectacle, and she succeeded, as they did, because on and off stage and screen she was good theater, a good ad-libber, a wit, a vivacious creator of comic crosstalk that foreshadowed the Beatles' press conferring ease. She regarded her appearances before the press as little comedy shows that she deftly directed. She acted out her personality in films, just as the Beatles created their personalities through their music and movies. She became increasingly skilled and sophisticated in her film work, just as they became more musically ambitious and adept. Finally, like them, she mythologized herself, drawing on her past and future as, in essence, her only subject, even while withdrawing from the public and focusing more on her art than on public acclaim. Chapter 7. Search for Self. The Method. November 1954 to May 1956. Goethe said, "Talent is developed in privacy, you know." And it's really true. There is a need for aloneness, which I don't think most people realize for an actor. It's almost having certain kinds of secrets for yourself that you'll let the whole world in on only for a moment when you're acting. Monroe had been consulting with Milton Greene for over a year about her own production company. His idea included the possibility of buying screen properties in which she could extend her capacity as an actress. If she could manage her career through her choice of sympathetic directors and producers, then she was prepared to entertain Greene's enthusiastic belief that she could play the roles she coveted. By the end of 1954, Marilyn Monroe Productions had been established, with Monroe as president and Greene as vice president. She had become convinced that her contract with Fox could be declared to have no legal standing, or at least that the formation of her own company would pressure Fox executives into giving her better roles and more control over the filmmaking process. Greene's reputation had been made as a superb photographer, not a producer. In his early 30s, he was very young. Many people thought to be taking on Fox, to be supporting Monroe during what turned out to be a year-long battle with her studio, and to be masterminding the making of movies he promised would be far more sophisticated than her earlier Hollywood products. Some of Monroe's friends distrusted his CRCHF or self. The M had 100 motives and suspected him of exploiting her. They advised her to pick someone with more experience, with more Hollywood savvy. Undoubtedly, Greene appealed to her precisely because he was not part of the Hollywood establishment. After all, what had old Hollywood hands like Charles Feldman done for her? He had secured the 7-year itch, to be sure. But at the price of her appearance in The Dreadful, there's no business like show business, and making no headway at all with Foxconn concerning her demands for more creative control of her movies. Moreover, she had not naively trusted the ambitious Greenes. She did not confide unreservedly in Milton's wife, Amy, who seemed particularly keen to ingratiate herself with influential people. Milton Greene had been introduced to Monroe by their mutual friend, Rupert Allen, and he had come to Monroe, on Allen's advice, with his portfolio in hand. Greene was brash and youthful-looking. He appeared to be about 18 years old in those days, Allen recalled. "You're just a boy," Monroe exclaimed. "You're just a girl," Greene immediately replied. Could Greene somehow take Monroe, just for what she was, and work with her identity from scratch? It is hard to say which of them was more excited by that prospect, since they were nearly equal in age and hopeful that their best years, their finest accomplishments, were ahead of them. Greene was more than just a charming talker, a young man with a quick wit remarkably like Monroe's, or a wit adaptable to her own spontaneous humor. His photographs of her capture that rare luminescence she could have in person, a brilliance even greater, if you can imagine that, Lee Strasberg told Fred Giles, than what appeared on the screen. Norman Mailer has captured in a sentence some of the impressive range Greene was able to capture in his photographs, which convey a mist of glamour, tenderness, amusement, sex, and subtle sorrow. Of women and their elegance superbly exhibits Greene's photographs of Monroe, and it reveals much not only about his relationship with her, but also about the kind of performer she was becoming as she realized her freedom from the restraints of earlier poses and positions. One black and white sequence, for example, demonstrates the evolution of a far more intriguing personality than was found in her earlier photographs. Monroe seems much older. In part, at least, the sense of age arises from the austerity of the setting. In the book's cover shot, her figure from the bust line downward is encased in a dark garment that is virtually indistinguishable from the black background. Her blonde hair, which is usually luxuriantly displayed, is barely seen and seems almost wispy at the sides CRCHF or self. The Met had 101 and shrouded by black at the top of her head. Her long, dark eyelashes enhance the mysteriousness of her hooded expression. She is almost smiling, but her lips are not parted. Her right eye is slightly open, and the left appears to be closed. The familiar teasing pose, half revealing, half concealing the sex symbol, is shaded here, suggesting ambiguity and perhaps a divided self, which is the insistent theme of Mailer's narrative of women and their elegance. This particular photograph is suggestive of a sexuality about which more needs to be known. But that sexuality seems rooted not simply in the body, but in what could be sadness in the eyes and smile, if she is indeed smiling. This woman's complex thoughts, her conflicting emotions, are not apparent in her earlier photographs. For the first time, perhaps, Monroe's sexuality and wry wit are seriously linked, but remain almost somberly elusive. She is a figure of shadow and light, a delicately poised, dark, impenetrable body, more nearly a part of the photographic medium than she had ever been before, and at the same time defined more provocatively as a person than any photographer had been able to do before. Like many of Monroe's other photographers, Greene pointed out that Monroe was hardly a passive subject for the camera. She almost never initiated the idea for a pose, but once he began to suggest ideas to her, she would respond immediately by adding her own distinctive touches. No photograph could work, Greene emphasized, without Monroe's full cooperation and understanding. Their fascinating collaboration reveals different attitudes toward the camera. At times, she plays up to it. Occasionally, she seems aloof and keeps her distance. Then there are poses in which her awareness of being photographed seems problematic, so that it is not clear whether she is entirely caught up with herself or seeming to be so in front of the prying lens. Or is it the photographer's selection of camera angles and focus that determines the diversity of feelings encoded in the photographs? Even if Greene was at the controls, so to speak, he had to navigate by Monroe's moods and to track an intricate and evanescent personality with the mechanisms at his disposal. However Greene's photographs are read, they offer indisputable evidence of maturation. They project Monroe's liberation from Hollywood. By the end of 1954, she was in New York City and in contact with Arthur Miller. Over several months, they drew closer together. From December 1954 to February 1955, Monroe stayed in relative isolation with the Greenes in Weston, Connecticut, before coming to New York to see RCHF or Self, the M. at Hod 102 romance with Miller, to investigate working with Lee Strasberg at the Actors Studio, and to begin her life and career anew. Soon she would be firmly under the influence of Greene, Strasberg, and Miller, the triumvirate, as she had been previously with Lydes, Carger, and Hyde. Although she retained some of her Hollywood connections, staying in close touch with the Carger family, for example, her professional relationships, particularly with Lydes, were broken. She allowed nearly a year to pass before having Lydes officially notified by telegram that she would no longer serve as Monroe's acting coach. To this triumvirate came Margaret Hohenberg, Milton Greene's psychoanalyst, who took on Monroe as a patient. At first, this arrangement solidified the bond between Greene and Monroe, but when the actress began to doubt Greene's loyalty to her in the following year, her therapeutic regimen seemed to result in a conflict of interest, especially when Hohenberg began giving career advice to Monroe and became, in effect, part of her entourage. Even though Monroe herself constantly mingled the business and personal sides of her life, sooner or later, this expanding circle of advisors seemed to constrict her. In her mind, Hohenberg would seem part of a campaign to control her both emotionally and professionally. But in early 1955, Milton Greene's influence on Monroe was at its great est, especially during her nearly 3-month stay in his home. His wife warmly welcomed Monroe and included her in household activities. The actress avidly read Amy's books, especially biographies of Napoleon and his wife Josephine. She was attracted to powerful mistresses of historical figures like Lord Nelson and to artists like Isadora Duncan. Of particular interest to her were women who invented themselves, so to speak, and imposed their personalities upon an age. Monroe, Amy Greene recalls, had a powerful need to hear stories, encapsulations of lives even as she worked on her own. The actress kept a diary full of her observations about conversations, magazine articles, and other items that caught her interest. In the Greenes' descriptions of this period, a remarkable sense of the actress's restlessness and drive emerges. They could hear her very late at night, sometimes reading, sometimes playing the radio. Usually, sleep would come only after her regular dosage of Seconal. Episodes of severe distress occasioned by her menstrual periods made Monroe weep over an internal ache no analgesic could assuage. Her Los Angeles physician, Dr. Lee Siegel, noted that she suffered from endometriosis, a condition in which womb lining tissue forms in places see RCHF or Self, the Met Hod 103 other than the womb, such as the ovaries or fallopian tubes. As a result, Monroe was often in agony and felt the pain acutely in her reproductive organs, a pain which increased due to the progressive nature of her ailment. As her then psychiatrist Ralph Greenson learned 4 years later during the making of Let's Make Love, Monroe dealt with her cycles of pain and insomnia by resorting to a wide variety of drugs. Demerol, a narcotic analgesic similar to morphine, phenobarbital HMC and amytyl barbiturates, and sodium pentothal, a depressant of the nervous system, primarily used in anesthesia. She impressed Greenson with her knowledge of pharmaceuticals, but she also scared him because she would mix several kinds of drugs together and was adept at getting prescriptions from several different doctors as well as from Milton Green. According to Donald Spoto, Green became addicted to the same kinds of drugs Monroe used and desperately resorted to them to increase his energy levels and hers. Some of these drugs, especially Demerol, she took by injection, and Greenson put a stop to that dangerous practice. To be always on is very wearing for performers. Even a strong woman like Barbara Stanwyck staggered in the glare of Hollywood's Klieg lights. As the actor Robert Wagner reveals in a memoir that describes his 4-year affair with her, Stanwyck regularly saw a psychiatrist. Like Monroe, she had trouble sleeping. Her psychiatrist had to prescribe sodium pentothal injections to sedate her. Like so many people in show business, Wagner observes, she was a prisoner of her career. Although there is no doubt about the debilitating consequences of Monroe's drug taking, previous accounts give the impression that she was immobilized and totally dependent on stimulants and sedatives, including alcohol. Yet this impression is misleading, as Greenson implied with his reluctance to term her an addict. She did not experience withdrawal symptoms when she abstained from medication. Although drugs sometimes impaired her ability to perform, they also became a crutch and gave her the lift some performers find in cocaine. In other words, she was caught up in intense moments of creativity while battling equally intense moments of fear and pain. While she rationalized her drug use, it is also clear that doctors, including her psychiatrists, could not identify the source of her pain or alleviate the anxiety that prevented her from sleeping. She turned to quick-fix remedies in order to cope with the relentless pressures that were a part of her position as one of the premier performers of her time. CRCHF or self. The M at HOD 104 initially, the Greens were a calming influence. Milton remained irrepressibly upbeat about Monroe's battle with Fox to have some creative control over her career. And Amy conducted herself with an authority the actress admired. Monroe took to heart some of Amy's advice on how to dress in a less flamboyant manner, and how to handle herself in a more understated fashion. Monroe husbanded her talent after years of profligacy in Hollywood. But if she became more circumspect about herself, she also knew that Milton Green had to be a showman and needed to keep his business partner in the public eye. So she consented to ride a pink elephant in Madison Square Garden in March of 1955 as part of a charity event. On the whole, however, Monroe became part of Green's sophisticated style. As can be seen in the manner his photographs of her closely match those of other models in Of Women and Their Elegance. These photographs give evidence that, for all her troubles, she had attained a fair amount of mastery over herself. In the Edward R. Murrow person-to-person interview broadcast live on April 8, 1955, from the Greens' home, Monroe appears exceedingly modest, as if she is indeed under the tutelage of this couple. Many of Murrow's questions are directed to Milton and Amy, and there is an air of condescension in his queries about whether Monroe is a good house egg used. It is almost as if they are discussing a child, and Monroe's tiny voice and diffidence certainly suggest something like a child's embarrassment in front of a camera. When asked about her new production company, she speaks of wanting to make good pictures and agrees with Murrow's leading question that she got tired of playing the same roles all the time and wanted to try something different. She offers a capsule history of her career, mentioning her work with Huston, Chekhov, Leides, and Wilder, and she attempts to make a significant comment on the importance of a director who is with you, really with you every moment. There is more behind her faltering comments than she conveys, but she appears vacuous and at one point shrugs her shoulders as though she is belittling what she has just said. She sounds like a little girl when she describes what joy it was to ride on the elephant in Madison Square Garden. All the while, Amy appears to be feeding Monroe cues, and as Amy strokes the dog that is lying beside them, Monroe does the same. She seemed to be confused about how to appear, writing a note to herself after the show, "I'm not M. I'm not permitted to be," and then crossing out not and to be. Monroe's confidence in the Greens seems to have weakened after the CRCHF or self, The Met Hod 105 Monroe interview. It was one thing to learn a more subtle way of presenting herself in the privacy of their home. It was quite another to have her tentativeness exposed on television, which was more than she, or probably anyone, could bear with equanimity. Monroe made no overt effort to break with the Greens, but her suspicions were aroused. Especially since she found it difficult to cope with the ambitions of others, and could not accept that inevitably their motivations would be mixed. She wanted to believe, on all counts, in their selflessness, or in a short time she would not believe in them at all. Perhaps the Greens were to her something like temporary help in her quest to revamp her career. She could never give herself to them as wholeheartedly as she did to her acting teacher, Lee Strasberg. At a dinner party in March, about a month before her interview with Monroe met Cheryl Crawford, a Broadway producer and one of the co-founders of Actors Studio, the principal agency of Lee Strasberg's formidable influence on American acting. Apparently, Monroe was quite candid about her ambition to act larger, more complex roles, and Crawford responded by recommending a visit to Strasberg, who would size up her talent. It is quite likely that Monroe had been angling for an appointment with this acting master. But at the same time, she probably dreaded his legendary reputation for incisively evaluating the actor's method. For she had Elia Kazan accompany her on her first meeting with Strasberg. That initial encounter was nothing less than a comprehensive examination of her reactions to very personal, embarrassing questions designed to gauge her sensitivity, to ascertain how easily, quickly, and imaginatively she could react to what Strasberg termed the stimulus. Her extraordinary responsiveness surprised him, since he would have expected such acuteness to have been killed by her Hollywood milieu. Instead, it had remained fresh and alive, without really having been hurt. If anything, the sum of her experience had made her more sensitive than she had ever been before. As he described his impressions to Giles nearly 5 years after Monroe's death, Strasberg's voice still carried something of a sense of wonder, and a note of the incredulity that may have arisen during his first discovery of the miracle of Monroe's sensitivity. In his direct, even blunt treatment of her, and in his unshakable faith in her talent, Strasberg may well have reminded her of Michael Chekhov, a man, Strasberg observed to Giles, who intrigued Monroe. The change from Chekhov's to Strasberg's teaching was not disruptive. After all, both men had been schooled in the Stanislavski approach CRCH, F, or self. The M at Hod 106 to acting, and Strasberg professed nothing but respect for Chekhov. Thus she came to Strasberg not to learn a whole new way of acting, although newspaper accounts would make it seem so, but to work on, as Strasberg told Giles, her conscious control of herself as an actress, on her discipline and concentration. Although Strasberg doubted that she read much of Stanislavski and suggested it was enough for her to absorb his principles in acting classes, it seems more in character for Monroe to have read part of Stanislavski seriously, to have attempted him just as she tackled, but could not totally master Todd, and then turned to Strasberg for further inspiration. Like Chekhov, he was a scholar of the theater, and he responded to her out of his deep immersion in theatrical history, comparing her favorably to the finest stage performers, like Jean Eagles in Rain, an actress who haunted his imagination. Strasberg took Monroe out of the vacuum of her search for self and method, out of those necessary, but now superannuated 3 months of quiet study at the Greens. He urged a fundamental recovery of her roots as a person and a basic reassessment of her techniques as an actress, so that the sources of her creativity could be revealed and channeled into finer performances. He saw that she was already an accomplished actress, especially in The 7-Year Itch, but he also saw her uncertain ties. Even though audiences had been satisfied with her performances thus far, the actress acknowledged the futility of not knowing how to achieve her best work. For both personal and professional reasons, Monroe worked privately with Strasberg. He explained to Giles that it was too difficult for her to subject herself to public scrutiny. Work at the studio is done before members who then take what you've done apart. Edward Easty, a fellow student at the studio, found Monroe's reluctance to act in public unusual, but Strasberg stressed that she was terrified of a live performance because all of her professional work had been done on film. Moreover, she was braving an intimidating situation that many actors and actresses, even those who had gone through the trials of opening on Broadway, would not countenance. James Dean, for example, walked out of a studio class that he felt was sterilizing him with severe criticism. Stella Adler, one of Strasberg's group theater associates, attacked him for having stripped actors of their personalities by encouraging what is commonly known as the method, an intense concern with how the actor's private life informs his acting roles. See RCHF or self. The Met Hod 107 Monroe's use of the method remains controversial, and opinions of her directors, casts, and crews on the sets of her final films, from Bus Stop to The Misfits, remain deeply divided about its usefulness. Even Strasberg's supporters do not deny that the method makes actors vulnerable. Ellen Burstyn points out that the increased sensitivity produced by the method might threaten the equilibrium of the self, might make life more painful. But actors require that excruciating sensitivity, she believes, and they have to be willing to risk themselves for their art. It is an art, Helen Hayes suggests, that by its very nature makes actors volatile and overly emotional because we are so aware of our own pain and doubts and fears in life, just as we are aware of those of everyone around us. And when you are in on those inner secrets of people's hearts and souls, you can't just become as wonderfully detached and cool-headed as a surgeon or a legal mind. Some of Monroe's friends opposed her use of the method because they believed it fractured her ego by having her recall traumatic past experiences. Arthur Miller, always wary of the Strasbergs, contended that the method imprisons actors in their subjectivity and turns the social life of the theater too far inward, so that the reciprocal relationship between characters and their audience is ruined. In film, on the other hand, the method is more acceptable, he conceded, because it is adaptable to the camera's proximity to private emotions. Miller may have been thinking of film's singular ability to suggest inner feelings by focusing so precisely on an actor's features and gestures. Monroe claimed that before her film career began, her feelings were not reckoned. They simply vanished unrecorded and unheeded by others. It is easy to understand why she would find the method attractive, for it makes acting excruciatingly intimate, close up to the actor's person, thereby fusing, or at least bridging, the break between private and performing selves. Strasberg was responding to both sides of her, and she found it necessary to center her career hopes on his efforts to unite her disjointed identity. Or, as he put it to Morris Solito, what was going on inside was not what was going on outside, and that always means there may be something there to work with. Strasberg would serve, in many ways, as the integrating force in her life, and would earn the gratitude and respect of many of her professional associates. John Springer, who would work as Monroe's East Coast publicist during the final 3 years of her life, had ample opportunity to witness the positive difference Strasberg made in his client's life. Indeed, see RCHF or self. The M at Hod 108 to listen to Springer describe Monroe's deep involvement with Strasberg, and the actor's studio is to realize how close she came, under Strasberg's guidance, to making acting and her life all of a piece. With Michael Chekhov's death in September of 1955, Strasberg became the sole focus of Monroe's highest aspirations as an actress. On first hearing of her work with Strasberg, Billy Wilder suggested that it would spoil Monroe's natural instincts. She would become self-conscious and lose her audience. He subscribed to a rather common belief that she was a natural, but he was ignoring much of her deliberate preparation for earlier films. He regarded her as an essentially passive actor, which meant that Strasberg was doing something to her. Strenuous acting exercises would burden her with extraneous techniques. Yet for all of Wilder's difficulties with her later on their film, Some Like It Hot, he had to admit that, if anything, her acting had improved. As John Huston put it to Fred Giles, she acted from the inside out, allowing the camera to record emotions as they arose to the surface of her whole visible self. Like many other accomplished screen actors, she learned to let the camera trigger her feelings and target her attention. Both Strasberg and Joshua Logan, her director on Bus Stop, suggested as much. Strasberg realized that the method was the actor's means of collaborating with the camera's pinpointing of action, and his insistence that every gesture, every movement, have its motivation made clear his affinity with psychoanalysis. He used terms like sublimation, by which he meant the actor's ability to free his own experience, to make it available for contact with the character she is playing. With Monroe, Strasberg found it necessary, as he had with other actors, to recommend that she see a psychiatrist, so that the deeply emotional recreations of her past in acting exercises would receive appropriate clinical treatment. If it was dangerous to evoke her childhood traumas, there is no evidence to suggest that he burdened her unduly with recollections of the past, or that he emphasized them inordinately. On the contrary, his practice was to use no more of such past experience than was absolutely necessary to a part. He had little patience with self-indulgence and could abruptly dismiss a student by saying, "Don't enjoy your ability to weep." Robert Hethman observed Strasberg handle personal emotions with great delicacy and tact, and with great watchfulness, as can be seen in this tape-recorded example of his instructions on the use of affective memory. Why you try to see the people that you saw. You try to hear the things that you heard. You try to touch now the things you touched then. See RCHF or self. The Met Hod 109, you try to remember through your senses what your mouth tasted, and what you wore, and the feeling of that garment against your body. The emotion you try not to remember at all. He sharply cut off any attempt to withdraw from the actuality, the objectivity of the actor's performance. Really look at us. Don't just make believe. Really see us. Make clear to yourself that you're real and we're real. There had to be an engagement between actor and audience, not a retreat into fantasy. Instead of causing further distress by recalling what was sometimes a painful past, Strasberg found in his own practice that the work at the studio helped the psychoanalysis, and the psychoanalysis helped the work. Certain, very sharp or strong things aroused in Monroe's acting could be further explored in therapy, or certain things that were blocked in her psychoanalytical sessions were revived and clarified in the concrete acting exercises designed to stimulate sensory memories. Thus, psychoanalysis and the method were mutually beneficial. Monroe herself seemed to endorse the symbiosis between the method and psychoanalysis in a dream starring Strasberg as the best, finest surgeon, cutting her open after Dr. Hohenberg had prepared the actress for an operation that aimed to bring her back to life. But what had caused her terrible disease baffled Monroe, whose hyphenated spelling of the word, which she underlined, signals her lack of equilibrium. Arthur Miller stood outside in this dream, worrying and hoping for a successful outcome, for many reasons, for myself for his play, and for himself indirectly. In retrospect, the dream seems prophetic, since it acknowledged Monroe's confusion about exactly what troubled her, even when she thought she was receiving the best of care. Miller's presence may be comforting to her, but it is also disturbing, since she senses that his success depends somehow on her own. In other words, Monroe was coming to the realization that Miller was becoming as dependent on her as she was on him. Others, such as Hedda and Norman Roston, hover as concerned friends, without the power to do no more than check in on her, while Milton Greene is pictured, relaxed, and enjoying himself even if he is very worried at the same time. The source of his worry is not identified, although in the context of the dream it would seem that Monroe's health is probably his concern. But the dream may also signify that, like Miller, Greene is just as concerned with his own well-being, now that it is tied to hers. The shocking denouement of the dream is that there is absolutely nothing there. In other words, the void is within herself. The import of the dream would later become the basis for Norman Mailer's CRCHF or self. The M. at Hod 110 biography of Monroe. Even though he did not have access to this account of her dream, a deeply disappointed Strasberg is academically amazed, because he was so sure there would be so much, more than he had ever dreamed possible in almost anyone. Instead, only finely cut sawdust, like of a Raggedy Ann doll, spills all over the floor and table. Both Strasberg's dreams and hopes for theater are fallen, and Hohenberg's dreams and hopes for a permanent psychiatric cure is given up. Arthur is disappointed, let down. Of all Monroe's enablers, Lee Strasberg may have seemed to her the least self-interested. The method promised Monroe a renewed sense of authenticity, of her struggle with her Hollywood career, he observed. Sometimes when an actor is in her position, the successful playing of the same kind of thing causes you to feel that you are getting away with something. A feeling of guilt develops. Throughout his talks at the studio, Strasberg stressed the actor's frustration with the repetition of what Hethman calls, essentially the same element of himself that brought him initial success. Like many other actors, Monroe regarded the studio as a sanctuary and a laboratory where she was free to experiment, to confront openly the questions many typecast actors ask. Can I do it again? Can I do anything else? Can I work with a different director? Can I play a different type? Do I really have talent? On the set of show business, Monroe had been terribly embarrassed when she met Susan Strasberg and her mother, Paula, because she had performed clumsily. At the studio, she heard Lee Strasberg say something like, "This is a place where you can fall flat on your face." When actors came to admit and then solve their problems, the studio offered the only kind of institutional support and the only kind of artistic continuity available to Monroe, who, like most American actors, lacked access to something like the English repertory system, where actors are more or less constantly employed in a variety of roles. In describing how it was for even the most successful actors, Strasberg revealed why it was possible for Monroe to feel acute distress in spite of having performed well. Actual conditions of work are for the actor extremely poor. The actor works, let's say, on a movie. It takes him months. He works in a disjointed way that hardly permits his imagination to be aroused. Then he loafs around because he's glad to loaf around after getting up all those months at 6 o'clock in the morning and finishing at 6 at night. He gets pretty tired, then he does another picture somewhere else. The disruptive routine of picture making is XCRCHF, or self. The Met Hod 111 Ackley what Monroe had forsaken in an effort to rouse her deepest creative instincts. She courageously left Hollywood at the height of stardom, and Strasberg responded to her risk-taking by carefully timing her transition into acting at the studio. After about 3 months of private study in his home, she appeared confident enough to join one of his classes of about 30 students that met twice a week. This did not make Monroe an AC Tours studio member, for that privilege could be earned only through a rigorous series of auditions. She entered the public studio classes as an actor's studio C. 1956, CRCHF, or self. The M at Hod 112 observer, like other interested parties, including Gloria Steinem, who met her briefly. A quiet Monroe rarely asked questions. Occasionally, she took notes. According to one observer, she exhibited an avid ESD in every scene performed by her fellow actors and in every word of criticism and instruction offered by Strasberg. She had difficulty understanding his classes, perhaps because of terminology like justification and substitution, and one of her fellow students helped to translate the teacher's words. She behaved like a neophyte, as did other actors and actresses with significant reputations, who felt humbled by the experience of probing so profoundly the fundamentals of acting. This group activity encouraged a sense of equality. For the first time in her career, Monroe's dedication to herself and to acting was part of a collective enterprise. Strasberg called upon actors to engage in what Stanislavski called living the part. This meant both observing and internalizing not just human emotions and actions, but also animal behavior and the function and placement of objects. As with Todd and Chekhov, Monroe was called on in Strasberg's classes to identify with principles of structure and composition, while at the same time feeling her way into the shapes and positions of things and into the gestures and rhythms of creatures other than herself. For example, she had to improvise her version of a kitten. She prepared by borrowing one, studying him intensely for 2 weeks, and then presented herself to the class as a playful, lazy, stretching, scratching, purring kitten. This classic Stanislavski exercise, with its call for acute, penetrating observation of life in all of its specificity, contributed to Monroe's ease of movement on stage, even as it sharpened her concentration and control. It is not as if she had not moved well before, of course, but now she recognized that even greater ease of movement was the product of intimate contact with nature. Another cardinal goal of Stanislavski's approach that made her achievement seem, once again, organic, an aspect of existence itself and not an external copy of it. One can readily imagine Monroe identifying with the kitten's feline grace. But more significantly, to be a kitten involves shedding adult inhibitions in order to recover a primordial spontaneity free from stereotyping. From the Hollywood manufacturing of Marilyn Monroe, society as a whole imposes rigid codes of behavior, and theater, similarly, contributes its clichés, Stanislavski noted. In order to enact life, to embody a character with originality, he counseled that an actor, like an infant, must learn everything from the beginning to look, to walk, to talk, and so on. We see RCHF or self. The Met Hod 113 do these things badly in ordinary life, and our faults show on stage, he concluded. To behave like a cat is to loosen up immediately, to become aware of how we have learned to contract our muscles in conformity with social habits and public decorum. We stiffen on the stage unless we learn how to release physical tenseness. As a new Strasberg pupil having to go through the entire regimen of the method while stripping away layers of conventional behavior, Monroe studied everything. Fresh characterizations are obtained only through exacting training of the body and the self. She was instructed to sing a popular song without moving her body, so that she used the inner nervousness subjectively instead of leaking it out through random, unconscious bodily tics and jerks. Strasberg echoed Stanislavski's emphasis on the necessity for gestureless moments of immobility on the part of the actor, to concentrate on his feelings all the attention of the spectator. Various exercises were used to induce relaxation and to stimulate spontaneous expression. Monroe progressed from acting exercises to the performance of scenes in class. With a fellow student, Phil Roth, she first chose to prepare a scene from Clifford Odditz's Golden Boy, a drama about a young man, Joe Bonaparte, who abandons the development of his real self, of a career in music, for the moneyed success of the prize ring. Harold Clurman, Odditz's good friend and group theater colleague, called the play a story of the artist who becomes a thing, and noted that Hollywood and what it represents provided the play with its inner theme, its true subject matter. Monroe had acted in Clash by Night, written for the screen by Odditz, and the playwright had met her on a few occasions, hoping to cast her in one of his projects. Odditz's own struggles with his integrity as a writer in Hollywood would obviously have interested her as a kind of subtext, and she would have quickly seen how the play defined not only the writer's dilemma but her own. Odditz, like his character Bonaparte, had once been a golden boy, enticed by fame and fortune to Hollywood, abandoning the promised great work of his theatrical career. Monroe, in every way a golden girl, had to wonder if she would ever get the opportunity to fulfill her artistic ambitions. Monroe's character, Lorna Moon, has a certain quiet glitter, and if she is sometimes hard, it is more from necessity than choice. Her eyes often hold a soft, sad glance. She feels like a tramp because she is always the mistress, never the wife. She is looking for legitimacy and for someone to authorize her worth, just as Monroe, feeling outcast and see RCHF or self. The M at Hod 114 demeaned, hoped to marry the highly principled Arthur Miller, who could confirm her probity. Lorna is very much like Monroe, in finding it difficult to hope for her heart's desire, yet hoping for it nonetheless. Through Lorna, Monroe made contact with the incisive, somewhat hard-edged, working-class side of her personality, the side that Richard Merriman encountered during his life interview with her. Stanley Flink called this aspect of Monroe her street smarts. Flink remembered that she was especially good at sizing up people and gauging their motivations, just as Lorna does on several occasions. Lorna is also reminiscent of Peg, the supporting character Monroe played in Clash by Night. Peg expresses an uninhibited, robust physical ID and a firmness of speech and gesture. "When I want you to kiss me, I'll let you know," she curtly tells her boyfriend, Joe Keith Andes. She sticks out her tongue at him and will not be bossed. Unlike Monroe the glamour girl, she does not slur her words suggestively. Instead, she is very direct and aggressive. She punches Joe when he jealously tries to deflect her interest in another man, Robert Ryan. This raw energy reflects the off-screen Monroe, who delighted in telling Stanley Flink how she would perform the physical business of her roles. Peg does not hesitate to order Joe to get her sweater or to bring coffee for visiting friends. She is ebullient, and she can be roughly affectionate, as Monroe could be when jumping off the scaffolding of a movie set into the visiting Flink's arms. Lorna Moon is a harder, more cynical version of Peg, a conniver of the first order who is overwhelmed by a feeling of genuine love for the first time in her life, for the fight manager, Tom Moody, who will turn Bonaparte away from music. Edward Eastie noticed Monroe's ease of movement as Lorna. Gone were the strained efforts of artificial behavior and cliches. She held nothing back. After the scene, Strasberg could not resist turning full way around in his front row seat, facing the entire assemblage and asking, or rather demanding, well, Was the scene excellent or not? To this, the answer was resoundingly unanimous in the affirmative. Eastie concludes. Monroe's triumph had come amid difficult circumstances, for many students at the studio distrusted Strasberg's championing of her, believing themselves far superior to this Hollywood import. Monroe had to satisfy a group of students, some of which suspected the teacher had been corrupted by recent favorable publicity and was abandoning his principles. According to Eastie, the audience sat in stunned, silent appreciation of Monroe's truthful rendering of Lorna Moon. Monroe had CRCHF or self. The Met Hod 115 moved slowly in her preparations for this scene, and he suggests W.E. might have had quite a long wait before seeing what she could really have done professionally. The sad part is that we all thought she had time. His use of we, after carefully noting the previous division of opinion on her talent, suggests the community of feeling Monroe was able to arouse and share, a solidarity of sentiment so different from the acrimony that prevailed on her movie sets. In December of 1955, after nearly 10 months of study, Strasberg judged Monroe ready to do a scene from Eugene O'Neill's Anna Christie for Actors Studio members. As early as the fall of that year, it had been decided that she would rehearse a scene with Strasberg's son, John, from Tennessee Williams's A Streetcar Named Desire for her private class as a way of practicing for her public debut, which finally occurred in early February 1956. The characters she chose to portray while at the studio reflected her own profound feelings of orphanhood, exploitation, and alienation. Anna Christie, in search of her father and feeling abused by life, prostituted. Lorna Moon, a lost baby whose mother was a suicide and whose father was an alcoholic, and Blanche Dubois, caught up in dreams of a romanticized self and terrorized by fears of fading beauty. These characters reminded Monroe of the attenuated hopes of youth, of how difficult it was to achieve a mature identity. Approaching the age of 30, Monroe knew that she had to move on to the next stage of her career, to take full possession of these roles. She chose Scene 5 of Streetcar, in which Blanche tries to seduce the young man collecting for the Evening Star. The scene demands that the actress convey a sense of Blanche in all her loneliness, coquetry, sensuality, romanticism, and resignation. Blanche dreams of a better, idealized world, while acknowledging the sordid one that is partly of her own making. In playing this role, Monroe confronted her own propensity for aggrandizing reality. Young man, has anyone ever told you that you look like a young prince out of the Arabian Nights? Blanche asks, in a desperate attempt to hold on to this youth and her own. Strasberg believed that Monroe rendered Blanche with a strangely poetic quality. For him, there was not only sensitivity, but grandeur in her evocation of Blanche's sadness and suffering. Monroe brought beauty to the part, he concluded. Evidently she understood that, like herself, Blanche Dubois, properly played, is a tragic, not a pathetic character. The opening scene from Anna Christie, which Monroe had used for an exercise with Natasha Lydes, was much longer and more ambitious CRCHF or self. The M et Hod 116 than what she had attempted in A Streetcar Named Desire. In Strasberg's words, Anna is supposed to be nervous, sick, she comes back to her father, she doesn't know what's going to happen. The dialogue at the beginning of the play is not of much help to the actress in conveying Anna's feelings, Strasberg observed, for at the moment of her entrance, you almost don't know who the girl is. And Anna is not ready to speak directly about her feelings. Monroe's success in adapting her tremulousness to suit Anna's febrile character was extraordinary. Strasberg emphasized how surprised the audience was that she could use her sensitivity so precisely. The precision had been developed during Monroe's serious study of the whole play. With Arthur Miller's help, she went over the text for a couple of hours, exploring Anna's identity, her way of thinking, her view of life. Did Anna want to die? Monroe's query derived from her perception of an exhausted, played-out character. She wanted to know exactly what accounted for Anna's fatigue, since her actions, not her words, would have to convey first her listlessness, then her growing anxiety about meeting and coping with her father. Monroe's questions cut two ways, toward the character and toward herself. Like Anna, she had set out on a quest to find her father, and had on more than one occasion intimated to friends her desire for death. Like Monroe, Anna is quick to resent people she thinks are laughing at her, and she feels she has been put upon deprived of her integrity, and exploited by her foster family. Anna implies that she was sexually violated at 16 by a cousin on the farm. If Monroe was reaching into the innards of her own life to play this part, she was also employing questions to get at what Strasberg called the subtext, that portion of the character's thinking that is indicated but not fully expressed. Even the character's life before she entered a scene should be considered as a way of getting at Stanislavski's notion of the imaginative fiction of another person. The playwright leaves certain aspects of the character unexpressed, and it is the actor's responsibility to go beyond the scraps and bits to create a whole person, a complete role with comparatively unbroken lines. Stanislavski points out, what was the unbroken line of Anna's emotional life? This is what Monroe wanted to know, so that she could establish the continuity of her performance and make Anna's life her own. Strasberg was unequivocal in his praise for Monroe's handling of Anna Christie, and he was struck with her presence, the unusual quality which she was able to maintain, to keep and somehow to create, and also to transmit more on the stage even than on the screen. Was he responding CRCHF or self? The Met Hod 117 to her aura, to the uniqueness of her original self. Strasberg speculated that the self-consciousness of the screen, the fact that everything has to be framed, blocked some of the brilliance he saw in the immediacy and exceptional control of Monroe's live performance. Evidently, her concentration was perfect, and even those in the audience who were not particularly taken with her admitted that she did not blow a line and that she had at least been competent, although one male studio member vigorously rejected the idea that Monroe was capable of playing Anna Christie. Kim Stanley, on the other hand, remembers that despite her initial skepticism, Monroe's performance was just wonderful. She was wonderful. We were taught never to clap at the actor's studio. It was like we were in church, and it was the first time I'd ever heard applause there. Some of us went to her privately and apologized. Strasberg acknowledged to Fred Giles that doing the scene had been very difficult for Monroe, and he was not certain that she could follow through with a complete performance, but he persisted in his belief that she was making her way toward a stage career. Cheryl Crawford rated Monroe's acting quite extraordinary, full of color, but she could not credit Monroe with a place in the theater. Essie was paralyzed with fear. It was too rough. She'd have a spasm every time she'd go on. Maureen Stapleton, Monroe's partner in the scene, tried to relieve the tension by suggesting they put a copy of the play on the table in front of them. Lots of people do it, she reassured her earnest colleague, but Monroe treated the occasion as though it were opening night on Broadway, and refused to regard her performance as informally as Stapleton suggested it was. Rehearsals were repeatedly interrupted because Monroe forgot her lines, yet her actual performance was flawless. T-Hat exceedingly wispy voice of hers seemed to carry all right, for all her worrying about it, Stapleton recalls. Afterwards, she accompanied Monroe to a bar on 10th Avenue and celebrated having cheated death one more time. Performing well for this high-strung actress seemed tantamount to surviving as both a person and a professional. Monroe herself is said to have been distraught immediately after her Anna Christie scene. I was terrible, she sobbed. Friends tried to console her, citing Strasberg's superlatives, but she remained unconvinced, insisting that the only thing that was great was Maureen. Strasberg himself lauded her concentration, which did not give way or slip once, as she recorded in a note to herself. Marilyn, there will be very few times ever on the stage where it will be necessary to keep CRCHF or self, the M at Hod 118, such a concentration for 1/2 hour straight. Instead of accepting his compliment, she wondered if her triumph had simply been accidental. But as she recorded in her notes, Strasberg refused to stint on his praise, suggesting, why our sensitivity would not be the same if you didn't have Monroe interviewed, 1956, CRCHF or self. The Met Hod 119 The Fearful Misgivings. She should not ignore them, but instead handle them by growing more proficient in the technical things that could be used to channel her anxiety. Strasberg's own daughter, Susan, had unusual self-discipline, he told Monroe, but she had a sensitivity, much deeper and stronger than that of Susie's. That very sensitivity left Monroe dangerously exposed and accounted for her fear of performing, which reminded him so much of the great actress Deuce. Monroe's anguish could not have been unexpected, for she had so much at stake, and it was part of her nature. As Milton Greene and Rupert Allen stressed, never to be content with her work. Susan Strasberg, on the other hand, attributes to Monroe a ploy performers often use. Criticize yourself before others get the opportunity, and you may be able to elicit sympathy and create a protective coating for yourself. Certainly Monroe had used such a strategy in her Hollywood career. About a week after she did the scene, Fred Stewart, an actor who knew Strasberg well, complimented Monroe on her Anna Christie by emphasizing the AC Tress's strength, her way of making the character herself. Monroe was still very unsure about her success because she had no way to measure it. Doing a scene in front of a live audience was new to her, she told Stewart. She was happy to receive his support and gradually began to believe in the power of her stage performance. So much so that she was exhilarate ed and tremendously grateful for the opportunity Strasberg had given her. Even years later, Ralph Roberts, John Springer, and other friends idly recall how large a role her work with Strasberg played in Monroe's plans for her future. Monroe had completed assignments on 3 difficult roles and was acting with renewed conviction as she made plans for Bus Stop, the first film she had worked on since leaving Hollywood in late 1954. In late December of 1955, prolonged negotiations with 20th Century Fox culminated in a new 7-year contract, which stipulated that she could specify a list of directors acceptable to her and be allowed to do outside productions. She would have to appear in 4 Fox films, for which her corporation would be paid $100,000 per film, to be split evenly between herself and Milton Green. After having spent a rather quiet year on her own, Monroe left New York on February 26, 1956, for Hollywood, inspiring intense curiosity among members of the press. To one reporter, she seemed somehow different. She replied almost shyly that her suit was new, but otherwise she was the same person. It was a typical light-hearted, self-effacing calm CRCHF or self. The M et had 120 meant that belied the new confidence and control she would soon display in her portrayal of Cherie. Monroe's progress from Strasberg's classes to the set of Bus Stop is comparable to the advance in sophistication reflected in Stanislavski's progress from an actor prepares to building a character, his classic texts on acting. In the first 2 chapters of the latter work, one is able to observe the actor moving beyond his exercises in an actor prepares to mastery of a whole role in a complete performance. Indeed, Monroe's creation of her character, Cherie, reads almost like a textbook case, an idealized version of the collaboration between script writer, director, and actor that the great film theorist Pudovkin called for, but regretfully did not realize in his own work. After Josh Logan completed his direction of Bus Stop, he said that Monroe conceived the basic approach to Cherie. The director, of course, helped her get it on film, but it was her feeling about the whole story that stimulated Logan and the screenwriter, George Axelrod, who would incorporate the actress's interpretation of her role into his rewriting of certain scenes. Only rarely have actors had the opportunity to influence a film so directly. Logan's supreme trust in Monroe, built on his belief that she was one of the great talents of all time, has on occasion been matched by other directors, but never surpassed. Logan had not been predisposed to praise Monroe. At the first suggestion that she play Cherie, he exclaimed, "Marilyn Monroe can't bring off Bus Stop." He acknowledged her box office success, but he did not believe she could act. Strasberg's belief in her greatness astounded Logan. How could the smug and pedantic acting teacher take Monroe seriously? But for the first time, Logan had heard Marilyn praised by someone in the theater. He decided to risk working with her and changed his mind about her during their first meeting. She talked persuasively about Bus Stop's story, had carefully observed Kim Stanley's portrayal of Cherie on the New York stage, and demonstrated how easily she could catch her character's Southern accent. Then Logan had one of those perceptions that seemingly join the realms of film and reality. Oh, of course, she was the perfect girl to play the part. Kim Stanley had had to readjust her looks, her height, her weight, and everything else to appear as this girl, but Marilyn was Cherie, presto in the flesh. Monroe had her character's childlike enthusiasm and dreaminess, but she was much more lucid and perceptive than her counterpart, as Logan indicated. Essie struck me as being a much brighter person than I had ever imagined, one who see RCHF or self. The Met had 121 accurate reactions to each well-made point, filled the director with a wonderful sense of promise about the whole production. It is likely that Monroe was following Stanislavski's injunction about living the part and sought to show Logan her mastery quickly. As they worked together, Logan recalled, "Essie wanted to know all about my studying with him in Moscow. She wanted to know all about the way actors lived and acted there, how Stanislavski talked to them and they talked to him, intimate details." She used Freudian terminology somewhat clumsily and self-consciously, but Logan was certain that Strasberg had opened a locked part of her head, given her confidence in herself. Bus stop, 1956, CRCHF or self. The M at HOD 122 in her brain power, in her ability to think out and create a character. The acting teacher had provided Monroe with an outline, a kind of map, to consult en route to her role, Susan Strasberg explained. Strasberg's mother, Paula, was the great technician who helped Monroe explore the streets, the towns, the rivers, the fine details of a role. Like Natasha Lydes, Paula Strasberg was put in an uncomfortable position every time Monroe insisted that she be present on the movie set. Strasberg would be suspected of usurping the director's responsibility for guiding the actress during her performance. Few directors, not even the sympathetic Josh Logan, were in a position to witness the way Paula and Monroe worked on scenes together, such as in the Old Black Magic sequence, which called for the subtlest execution of a bad performance. Overdoing the song would coarsen Monroe's character. Underplaying it would diminish her character's vitality. Interpreting the numbers, every note, engrossed the actress and her coach and irritated others, who were intolerant of Paula's claim on Monroe's time. Even Logan, the most generous of Monroe's directors, did not recognize the style Paula helped to develop. Why did Monroe, who had such good instincts in her reading of a role, need a coach at all? She often spoke poetically, in similes and metaphors that someone had to help her unravel and interpret. Hers was not a logical way, Lee Strasberg explained to Fred Giles. Rather, she would make comparisons. I sent this like or so on, and she would be completely right about a part, while still needing to locate the precise terms that writers and directors commonly deal in. She could seem very kooky to a professional who did not have the patience to follow her. What do you mean the character should be burning, as if she's sitting on a stove? Is Strasberg's example of a frustrated response to Monroe's figurative language. She would become clearer as she went on, he remembered. As he would always see the character, she would always see what the real event was, not just what the people were saying. She was so good at evaluating scripts that Paula Strasberg planned to publish Monroe's marginal notations after the actress's death. Monroe attacked her part with a dynamism that still invigorated Logan's prose when he recalled her taking charge. When the costume designer delivered a set of clothes that were too grand, too movie star, not pitiful, comic, and humorous enough for Sherry, Monroe laughingly told Logan that they were going to shred it up, pull out part of the fringe, poke holes in the fishnet stockings, then have them darned with big, sprawling darns. Oh, it's going to be so sorry and pitiful, and it'll make CRCHF or self. The Met Hod 123 you cry. She then proceeded to rummage through the costume depart, meant to find the oldest, the most worn, the saddest bits of clothing that would still somehow express the spirit of a character whose reach would exceed her grasp. Similarly, Milton Green eschewed using Monroe's usual, honey-colored, makeup in favor of a light opalescent color, Cherie and Beau, 1956, CRCHF or self. The M at Hod 124, very thin and white. It was a daring experiment that the actress and her co-workers enthusiastically accepted as appropriate for a little nightclub singer who always went to bed at 5 or 6 in the morning after drinks and woke up way past noon to a breakfast of black coffee and aspirin. A girl who never really saw the sun, Logan remarked. Although her studio bosses vehemently protested the risks Monroe and her collaborators were taking with the film, Logan insisted on artistic control, and Monroe had her way, with Logan's consent, on most of the major decisions in the production. As a result, she exuberantly put herself into the whole film, even suggesting ways of staging certain scenes and setting up cameras. Only twice did Monroe exhibit the temperament that bedeviled her earlier, less sensitive directors. When Logan caught her still looking at herself in her dressing room mirror hours after she was due on the set, and when she lost her composure with her co-star, Don Murray, and raked him across the face with her sequined costume, scratching the core nerve of his eye. Murray dismissed her aggression as that of a childlike personality. She operated from a very self-centered viewpoint. She wasn't deliberately mean, but she did show a surprising lack of empathy. When Murray balked at mounting a horse because he had not yet had a riding lesson, she said, "Just do it." It was his first film, and her lack of professional skill surprised him. She came to the set late, could not remember her lines, and often did as many as 20 takes of a single scene. She kept missing her marks, the positions actors have to hit in order to be properly lit and recorded. Word also got out that she was annoyed with Murray because he seemed far more interested in Hope Lange, Hemar Rider, who played Elma Duckworth, a young girl Sherry confides in. Murray's testimony demonstrates the stress Monroe's self-absorption put on cast and crew. In other contexts, however, she exhibited a special talent for taking people on their own terms. Rupert Allen remembers the way she would work a party, making sure that she met as many people as possible, sitting down with them and really taking an interest in their lives while remaining accessible. Logan observed that she was always the most fun to talk to listen to, warm, witty, and enthusiastic. Her training in the method enhanced this outgoing quality. Part of Stanislavski's legacy, first adumbrated for her by Michael Chekhov, was the directive to urge actors to take in everything, to adopt a broad point of view, to interpret the life of human souls from all over the world. Strasberg speculated that the painfulness of Monroe's own past CRCHF or self, the Method 125, and her wounded sensitivity created an avidness for life, a reaching out that she had when she would listen to you. Her eyes were all wide, and I don't think she was just acting. She really took in whatever it was that she was interested in. Similarly, Rupert Allen recollects Monroe relishing the New York Times, the excited interest she would exhibit in speaking of world affairs, in one specific instance calling him to make a shrewd comparison between front-page stories in the New York newspaper and the Los Angeles Times. Her correspondence about politics with Lester Markle, then Sunday editor of the New York Times, corroborates Allen's memories of Monroe's keen engagement with current events. In dressing her character, to use Stanislavski's term, Monroe was employing everything she knew about self and society and turning away from her the image she had developed in previous films, in which she had been encouraged to act from the outside in, taking care to have her look like the part before she felt the part. As a result, both herself and her roles were somewhat specious. Now she proceeded in the opposite direction, delving within herself to authenticate both her person and her character, Sherry. Since Monroe could not think of Sherry as simply a role given to her, she had to come up with a Sherry of her own. Like the actor in building a character, she found there is no quick route to rapport with a role. The actor begins in uncertainty not only about his character, but about himself. I was not I, in the sense of my usual consciousness of myself. Or, to be more precise, I was not alone but with someone whom I sought in myself and could not find. It is as if the actor abnegates himself, holds himself in suspension, in order to create room for the role to emerge. I existed, I went on with my usual life, yet something inhibited me from giving myself up to it fully. Something was disturbing my usual existence. I seemed divided in two. The actor becomes aware of a secret subconscious life, a second life, after confronting the question of whom I was to play. Looking into the mirror does not aid the actor in discovering his identity because he has not yet found the source of it within himself. He begins to feel himself in character as he alters his conventional theatrical makeup, his costume, and selects the props for a character he still cannot properly name. Nevertheless, he seems compelled to apply himself to a characterization that is slowly rising from inside of him until, glancing once again in the mirror, he does not recognize himself. He has, in fact, used himself as an instrument to transform himself. Every step he has taken in the creation of his character is his own, yet the result is that he is not entirely himself. He has created something new, original, fresh, CRCHF or self. The Method 126, much as Monroe, according to Strasberg, took in the feelings of others and had an extraordinary ability to see something in a fresh way that was completely her own and to draw attention to it with a kind of directness. A precision which couldn't be said or seen for that matter in any other way. Now Monroe had a role that was not just bits and pieces of film, but a role that had grown organically, and that might survive the edited process. This was certainly not the first time she had come to a movie set with her character well worked out, but it was the first instance of her total immersion in a character, speaking in that character's accents even when filming had stopped, as other method actors like James Dean had done. Monroe still found the actual process of filming discontinuous and profoundly disturbing. Sometimes she would hold onto a crewman burr's arm and pace around the edges of the soundstage. Occasionally, she would retreat in total isolation from cast and crew. She interrupted scenes and requested time to think off to the side of the action. Logan remembers her feverish concentration and how in her effort to perform well she would stop and wrinkle her face as though in pain before she could continue. Interruptions in filming would throw off her concentration, and it could take several minutes before she was able to resume her character's mood. Logan decided to keep his cameras going in order to overcome Monroe's halting performances. Instead of crying cut after each take, he simply put her into the position appropriate for the beginning of the scene, or handed her the first prop in the scene, or had the script supervisor give her the first line, so that she and the camera kept moving. Logan had come to perceive that, the moment the camera started turning, Marilyn turned on with it. This unusual and expensive way of filmmaking yielded several interesting takes of individual scenes, none of them dull or routine, and he therefore had a chance to piece bits and pieces of brilliance together until the final scene shone. Although her acting was mediated by film technology and the director's art, Logan was, in effect, inducing a live performance from Monroe by partially eliminating the stop-and-go element of filmmaking for her. The director suspected his star was inherently a stage performer, and he treated her as one by also recording her old black magic number live in order to capture the spontaneity that would be lacking if she sang the song to a playback, and then again for the camera by lip-syncing. She could never memorize CRCHF or self. The Met Hod 127 exactly the way she had sung it, breathed it, performed it, and still make it sound spontaneous, Logan concluded. Film conventions disconcerted the actress, Morris Zolito report ed, corroborating Don Murray's observations. Essie had to keep fixed positions, marked out on the set. A spontaneous reflex of emotion might move her out of the designated position so that the carefully set up camera framing would be destroyed. On the other hand, she delighted in the one-to-one relationship it was possible to have with cameras. Logan remembers the day she was dancing around like a child in anticipation of having a big head close-up as Garbo had had. All the features of her face would be enlarged, for the lens could concentrate on every vein, every tiny bit of facial fuzz, the watery depths of her eyes, the detail of her skin, her nostrils. Even when the close-up revealed a string of saliva as Monroe moved her head from the hand it had been resting upon. She agreed with Logan that the delicate moment showed great emotion and ought not to be edited out of the film. Logan put Monroe's performance in an intricate series of frames that had the effect of concentrating more attention on the impact of her char actor's personality, an effect not attempted by previous directors. At the beginning of Bus Stop, she is viewed in the frames of two windows. The first sight of Cherie is self-consciously cinematic and virtually voyeuristic in revealing the interior of her life. As Virgil, Arthur O'Connell, watches from his window in the boarding house, Cherie is already positioned on the ledge of her dressing room window with her right knee bent and her high-heeled shoe extended so that the pointed toe touches the side of the window frame. She is hot and weary, fanning herself. She seems almost ready to drop as her hand falls downward in a limp gesture. She is looking down disconsolately as cowboys crowd into her private moment, petitioning her for a dance. The camera cuts from Virgil watching her, to Beau Don Murray, admiring himself in all his freshness in the mirror of the boarding house room he shares with Virgil, to Cherie sitting again on the window ledge, this time harassed by her boss, who asks her why she is not inside, where you belong. He shakes her and tells her to go to work, throwing her onto a chair. As Virgil enters the saloon, she is pictured in front of the mirror crying and complaining about the boss who has called her an ignorant hillbilly. Her hand is cupped to the left side of her face, as she looks down and then up to her friend, Vera Eileen Heckart. Cherie scratches the back of her head, then hides her face in her hands, and then CRCHF or self. The M at Hod 128 scratches the back of her head again as she explains to Vera how she has been trying to be somebody. Then she puts her face in her hands again, places her hand to the right side of her face, and completes the repetitive cycle of hand and head and face gestures begun on her left side. A chronic cycle that she maintains with delicate consistency throughout the movie. Monroe's constant repositioning of her hand and head and face, and Logan's relentless reframing techniques, complement each other brilliantly in defining Sherry's fatiguing searching for an identity. When Sherry talks about River Gulch, the little town where I was born, she puts a finger to her lips, foreshadowing the lifted spirits that result from when she fingers the map that traces the history of my life. Her eyes open wide as she speaks of her dream of reaching Hollywood and Vine, and she dresses herself in her dreams as she picks up her saloon costume, the one she will wear when she sings that old black magic, and dilates on the magical impact of the movies that gave her a direction in life. In these brief moments of getting ready for the saloon crowd, Monroe is able to move her character deftly through memories of childhood, adolescence, and adulthood, many of them reflected in her changing expressions in the dressing room mirror. As Sherry gets into her dress, she conveys the feeling that she is getting into her life, which she almost seemed to have relinquished in the first shots of her. Joan Mellon has pointed out the obvious connections between Sherry and Monroe's biography, but of special importance is Sherry's dreaminess and her exact plotting of her journey to movie stardom, which parallels Monroe's calculating and determined route to her career. Although Sherry desperately wants to escape from Beau, her cowboy lover who believes he has found his angel, she hesitates momentarily when she learns that a life photographer will be present at her dreaded marriage. As it did for Monroe, the camera has almost a perverse fascination for Sherry, fixing itself in her consciousness even at a time when her appearance before it will cause her pain. As beguiling as these comparisons between the actress and her role are, why you cannot possibly tell where to draw the line between you and your part. Stanislavski insists, it is not fair to say the actress was playing herself. Sherry shows none of the hostility Monroe could exhibit towards Murray, a newcomer like Beau who treated Monroe respectfully, putting up with her sulks and refusal to apologize for scratching his eye. Sherry shares none of Monroe's informed commitment to her art or her talent, and is unsophisticated when compared to the 30-year-old woman who played her. At best, she CRCHF or self. The Met Hod 129 might have represented a former self to Monroe, the one who was a starstruck young girl, already a kind of cliché to Stanley Flink when she walked into the office of Life magazine in 1950 and presented her portfolio to him. Even at her worst, however, Monroe could never have given a performance as poorly delivered as Sherry's pathetic, old black magic number. Monroe maintains just the right balance between Sherry's meager skills and her naive certainty. This balance is best illustrated when Cherie achieves her own lighting effect during her song. She confidently yet awkwardly kicks a switch on stage that puts a spotlight on her, emphasizing the shabby gaudiness of her costume. She sings a song in a bad imitation of Hildegard and has tailored her figure out of parts taken from other performers, the scraps sewn together from a very limited theatrical wardrobe. She is hopelessly off-key and seemingly oblivious of the cowboys who ignore her as they continue their rowdy conversations. Several light bulbs suspended over the small band that accompanies her accentuate the tackiness of the scene. Yet in her own light, Sherry shines. Somehow she has managed to enclose herself in her own world, and her features are animated by her conviction that she has delivered a good performance. So much so that it is believable when Beau, the young cowboy on his first big trip off the ranch, is captivated by her angelic luminosity. She is the living embodiment of his obsession with the ideal. Indeed, the romantic, yearning theme song from Laura graces his entrance into the saloon, as Sherry commands the stage with her presence, performing above the darkened, noisy crowd that Beau does not notice until he has trouble hearing her song and whistles, warning the cowboys to be quiet. Her singing is dreadfully embarrassing, but there is a crazy zest in the way she spoils the rhythms of the song lyrics, and an endearing warmth in her Ozark drawl, as she makes do with drooping long black gloves and swings her scarf, sweeping Beau up in the emotions of his discovery. Beau's tribute to her reinforces Sherry's stilted, extroverted gestures as the cowboy crowd quiets. She winks at him, absolutely delighted and mischievously smiling like a kid who has been allowed to continue mimicking adult behavior. She tugs at her long sleeves, trying to keep them up, like a child struggling with an improvised costume. All of her gestures are elaborately staged. "I hear your name, and only your kiss can put out the fire," she sings, as she cups her hand to her ear and puts her fingers to her lips. There also seems to be a momentary reference to Monroe's own cheesecake days, when she half closes her lips and eyes in CRCHF or self. The M at Hod 130 comic sultriness, as though she were finally shedding all of the silliness of her former selves. Cherie is not just another one of Monroe's dumb blondes. There is a difference in the writing and the performing of this character, as there would be in her successors, like Elsie Marina, Sugar Kane, Amanda Dell, and Rosalind Tabor, the women Monroe plays in her last 4 films. Cherie has suffered disappointments in her effort to defy the world's intractability. Cherie has dreams of Hollywood stardom, but she seems much older, sadder, if not wiser, than Beau. She is certainly cautious and skeptical of the promises made to her. She has lived the romantic, yet melancholy music of Laura. She is more a whole person and less an unblemished character, not unreal like the girl or Pola or Lorelei Lee. She will not have the world on Beau's masculine terms and will not be cowed by all that love and stuff that other men have handed her. Beau ropes her not because she is innately helpless, but because she has been quite literally knocked out by her nightclub life, by defeats that Beau has yet to suffer. His untested energy is what overwhelms her. So much is apparent when he tries to rouse her from bed. Physically, she is incapable of competing with him, but she never gives in to him completely. Instead, she uses the ploy of the physically weak. She tries to escape or to distract him. At the same time, Cherie has avoided the crudity of backstage life. She betrays none of the bitterness Monroe expressed on movie sets. Cherie has not cultivated the cynicism that would arm her against a rapacious world. Her face often registers bewilderment and the vague pain of confusion, as does her characteristic gesture of putting her hand to the side of her face, as if to search for the source of her distress or to soothe her delicate nerves. In Beau's clutches, she sometimes behaves like a startled animal. There is something very fresh in Monroe's acting in these scenes, for Cherie's emotions are primary, unguarded, and Monroe plays them with great finesse. In his review of Bus Stop, Arthur Knight comments that there is no evidence in the film of the calendar girl. Indeed, in some scenes, Monroe and her director deliberately diminished her physical presence to give Cherie what one reviewer calls a little girl lost quality. For example, in The Roadside Diner, Cherie is photographed in her chilling uncertainty against a large, vertical black stove that stands imposingly behind her, its pipe running up to the ceiling. She has just come in from the cold to escape from Beau, who is sleeping on the bus, and for warmth and comfort, she clutches the front of her flimsy monkey fur coat with her left hand, CRCHF or self. The Met Hod 131, and with her right hand holds the collar close to her neck. She is near panic and is baffled by Beau's stolid pursuit of her. She is trying to hold herself together, and she looks waif-like and abandoned and caught in a moment of frightful transience, emphasized by the stands of cheap paw purbacks and postcards that flank her. How is it possible to believe that Cherie is an angel after so many shots of her wasted appearance? Oddly enough, her skimpy, ragged clothing invest her with an irresistible genuineness. Divested of resplendent costumery, Monroe makes Cherie's pale countenance ethereal, incandescent, as Knight puts it. After Beau has been beaten by the bus driver, Carl Robert Bray, who defends Cherie's right to resist Beau's advances, the camera moves in on Monroe's character in the close-up that so excited her. After his humiliation, Beau has softened, has seen how roughly he has trodden upon Cherie's feelings, and meekly begs her pardon. His humble apology, a whack, ends her tender emotions, which were stirred once before when he first declared his love for her. In tight close-up, she declares to Beau with the whole force of her being, "I'd go anywhere in the world with you." She throws away her map, abandoning her illusions about Hollywood. Beau has relinquished his about her as well, for he finally accepts her confession that she is not an angel, not the virginal figure he had made of her. Paradoxically, at this point, with their illusions destroyed, Cherie looks most like Beau's vision of an angel. His gaze into her face is swallowed up by the white depth of her skin. Her face covers the screen, And suddenly, the rare sensitivity that has made Cherie so vulnerable and yet inviolable is fully revealed. Beau will take her back to his ranch just as she is, because she still speaks to his sense of beauty and perfection. Bus Stop has a sentimental ending, to be sure, but it avoids having Monroe lapse into the passivity of her earlier roles. It is clear to Virgil, the old friend who has guided Beau to manhood, that Cherie will take care of Beau as much as he will her. In the final scene, she emerges as Virgil's equal when she insists that Beau allow him to go his own way. If he don't want to come, you can't make him. Cherie's words are moving, but the authenticity of Monroe's whole characterization is what makes the conclusion. Notice how sensitively Cherie's hands hold the ring box Beau has given her, and how her hand is tentatively laid on his shoulder, indicating her nervous realization of her attachment to him. Behind her diffidence is a lifetime of disappointment, because her simple human gestures have been disregarded. Monroe makes palpable the risk Cherie feels she takes off with Beau. When he first offers her his coat, she looks at it in a Sir CRCHF or self. The M at Hod 132 prized and uncertain manner, and then she leans back against him and smiles securely, her head tilted back and her eyes opening in recognition of what she has won. She enjoys enveloping herself in the big coat, in its warmth and softness, easing herself into this new relationship. Then she completes the gesture by turning her head to the right side of the coat with her mouth open and her eyes closed, just as she did with the left side. Beau draws the coat closer around her, and she brings her hand to her neck, also tightening the coat around her in a firm gesture radically different from her scared, hunching inside her flimsy costume coat in the bus stop. She draws Beau's hand to her and around her, and then, after closing her eyes and luxuriating once more in the coat, she ties her scarf around his neck. For now they are truly united. Monroe's gestures, like the whole film, are organic. Superb acting, the full creation of a character, make the corny conclusion convincing. Monroe's effort on Bus Stop was, as Logan affirmed, some kind of peak in her emotional as well as intellectual life. It was as if she made the movie set into a disciplined, innovative actor studio, and as if Logan helped her make good on Strasberg's ennobling and liberating advice to another actress. Be your own Stanislavski. I was 25 before I really understood what the whole creative process of acting was, Anne Bancroft remarked. Now at 30, Monroe might have said the same. Thank you for listening to Blur. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share for more immersive audiobooks.